Chapter 11. Some women, I grant, would not appear to advantage seated on a pillion, and attired in a drab Joseph and a drab beaver bonnet, with a crown resembling a small stew-pan; for a garment suggesting a coachman's greatcoat, cut out under an exiguity of cloth that would only allow of miniature capes, is not well adapted to conceal deficiencies of contour, nor is drab a colour that will throw sallow cheeks into lively contrast. It was all the greater triumph to Miss Nancy Lammeter's beauty that she looked thoroughly bewitching in that costume, as, seated on the pillion behind her tall, erect father, she held one arm round him, and looked down, with open-eyed anxiety, at the treacherous snow-covered pools and puddles, which sent up formidable splashings of mud under the stamp of Dobbin's foot. A painter would, perhaps, have preferred her in those moments when she was free from self-consciousness, but certainly the bloom on her cheeks was at its highest point of contrast with the surrounding drab when she arrived at the door of the Red House, and saw Mr. Godfrey Cass ready to lift her from the pillion. She wished her sister Priscilla had come up at the same time behind the servant, for then she would have contrived that Mr. Godfrey should have lifted off Priscilla first, and in the meantime she would have persuaded her father to go round to the horse-block instead of alighting at the doorsteps. It was very painful, when you had made it quite clear to a young man that you were determined not to marry him, however much he might wish it, that he would still continue to pay you marked attentions. Besides, why didn't he always show the same attentions, if he meant them sincerely, instead of being so strange as Mr. Godfrey Cass was, sometimes behaving as if he didn't want to speak to her, and taking no notice of her for weeks and weeks, and then, all on a sudden, almost making love again? Moreover, it was quite plain he had no real love for her, else he would not let people have that to say of him which they did say. Did he suppose that Miss Nancy Lammeter was to be won by any man, squire or no squire, who led a bad life? That was not what she had been used to see in her own father, who was the soberest and best man in that countryside, only a little hot and hasty now and then, if things were not done to the minute. All these thoughts rushed through Nancy's mind in their habitual succession in the moments between her first sight of Mr. Godfrey Cass standing at the door and her own arrival there. Happily the squire came out too, and gave a loud greeting to her father, so that somehow, under cover of this noise, she seemed to find concealment for her confusion and neglect of any suitably formal behaviour, while she was being lifted from the pillion by strong arms which seemed to find her ridiculously small and light. And there was the best reason for hastening into the house at once, since the snow was beginning to fall again, threatening an unpleasant journey for such guests as were still on the road. These were a small minority, for already the afternoon was beginning to decline, and there would not be too much time for the ladies who came from a distance to attire themselves in readiness for the early tea which was to inspirit them for the dance. There was a buzz of voices through the house as Miss Nancy entered, mingled with the scrape of a fiddle preluding in the kitchen. But the Lammeters were guests whose arrival had evidently been thought of so much that it had been watched for from the windows. For Mrs. Kimble, who did the honours of the Red House on these great occasions, came forward to meet Miss Nancy in the hall, and conduct her upstairs. Mrs. Kimble was the squire's sister, as well as the doctor's wife, a double dignity with which her diameter was in direct proportion, so that, a journey upstairs being rather fatiguing to her, she did not oppose Miss Nancy's request to be allowed to find her way alone to the Blue Room, where the Miss Lammeters' bandboxes had been deposited on their arrival in the morning. There was hardly a bedroom in the house where feminine compliments were not passing, and feminine toilettes going forward, in various stages, in space made scanty by extra beds spread upon the floor; and Miss Nancy, as she entered the Blue Room, had to make her little formal curtsy to a group of 6. On the one hand there were ladies no less important than the 2 Miss Gunns, the wine merchant's daughters from Litherley, dressed in the height of fashion, with the tightest skirts and the shortest waists, and gazed at by Miss Ladbrook of the old pastures, with a shyness not unsustained by inward criticism. Partly Miss Ladbrook felt that her own skirt must be regarded as unduly lax by the Miss Gunns, and partly that it was a pity the Miss Gunns did not show that judgment which she herself would show if she were in their place, by stopping a little on this side of the fashion. On the other hand, Mrs. Ladbroke was standing in skull-cap and front, with her turban in her hand, curtsying and smiling blandly and saying, "After you, ma'am," to another lady in similar circumstances, who had politely offered the precedence at the looking-glass. But Miss Nancy had no sooner made her curtsy than an elderly lady came forward, whose full white muslin kerchief and mob-cap round her curls of smooth grey hair were in daring contrast with the puffed yellow satins and top-knotted caps of her neighbours. She approached Miss Nancy with much primness, and said with a slow treble suavity, "Niece, I hope I see you well in health." Miss Nancy kissed her aunt's cheeks dutifully, and answered with the same sort of amiable primness, "Quite well, I thank you, aunt, and I hope I see you the same." "Thank you, niece. I keep my health for the present. And how is my brother-in-law?" These dutiful questions and answers were continued until it was ascertained in detail that the Lammeters were all as well as usual, and the Osgoods likewise. Also that niece Priscilla must certainly arrive shortly, and that travelling on pillions in snowy weather was unpleasant, though a Joseph was a great protection. Then Nancy was formally introduced to her aunt's visitors, the Miss Gunns, as being the daughters of a mother known to their mother, though now, for the first time, induced to make a journey into these parts. And these ladies were so taken by surprise at finding such a lovely face and figure in an out-of-the-way country place, that they began to feel some curiosity about the dress she would put on when she took off her Joseph. Miss Nancy, whose thoughts were always conducted with a propriety and moderation conspicuous in her manners, remarked to herself that the Miss Gunns were rather hard-featured than otherwise, and that such very low dresses as they wore might have been attributed to their vanity if their shoulders had been pretty, but that, being as they were, it was not reasonable to suppose that they showed their necks from a love of display, but rather from some obligation not inconsistent with sense and modesty. She felt convinced as she opened her box that this must be her Aunt Osgood's opinion, for Miss Nancy's mind resembled her aunt's to a degree that everybody said was surprising, considering the kinship was on Mr. Osgood's side, and though you might not have supposed it from the formality of their greeting, there was a devoted attachment and mutual admiration between aunt and niece. Even Miss Nancy's refusal of her cousin Gilbert Osgood, on the ground solely that he was her cousin, though it had grieved her aunt greatly, had not in the least cooled the preference which had determined her to leave Nancy several of her hereditary ornaments, let Gilbert's future wife be whom she might. 3 of the ladies quickly retired, but the Miss Gunns were quite content that Mrs. Osgood's inclination to remain with her niece gave them also a reason for staying to see the rustic beauty's toilette. And it really was a pleasure, from the first opening of the bandbox, where everything smelt of lavender and rose-leaves, to the clasping of the small coral necklace that fitted closely round her little white neck. Everything belonging to Miss Nancy was of delicate purity and nattiness. Not a crease was where it had no business to be. Not a bit of her linen professed whiteness without fulfilling its profession. The very pins on her pincushion were stuck in after a pattern, from which she was careful to allow no aberration. And as for her own person, it gave the same idea of perfect unvarying neatness as the body of a little bird. It is true that her light brown hair was cropped behind like a boy's, and was dressed in front in a number of flat rings that lay quite away from her face, but there was no sort of coiffure that could make Miss Nancy's cheek and neck look otherwise than pretty. And when at last she stood complete in her silvery twilled silk, her lace tucker, her coral necklace, and her coral eardrops, the Miss Gunns could see nothing to criticise except her hands, which bore the traces of butter-making, cheese-crushing, and even still coarser work. But Miss Nancy was not ashamed of that, for even while she was dressing she narrated to her aunt how she and Priscilla had packed their boxes yesterday, because this morning was baking morning, and since they were leaving home, it was desirable to make a good supply of meat pies for the kitchen, and as she concluded this judicious remark, she turned to the Miss Gunns that she might not commit the rudeness of not including them in the conversation. The Miss Gunns smiled stiffly, and thought what a pity it was that these rich country people, who could afford to buy such good clothes—really Miss Nancy's lace and silk were very costly—should be brought up in utter ignorance and vulgarity. She actually said mate for meat, appen for perhaps, and os for horse, which to young ladies living in good litherly society, who habitually said "orse" even in domestic privacy, and only said "'appen" on the right occasions, was necessarily shocking. Miss Nancy, indeed, had never been to any school higher than Dame Tedman's. Her acquaintance with profane literature hardly went beyond the rhymes she had worked in her large sampler under the Lamb and the Shepherdess, and in order to balance an account she was obliged to effect her subtraction by removing visible metallic shillings and sixpences from a visible metallic total. There is hardly a servant-maid in these days who is not better informed than Miss Nancy. Yet she had the essential attributes of a lady: high veracity, delicate honour in her dealings, deference to others, and refined personal habits. And lest these should not suffice to convince grammatical fair ones that her feelings can at all resemble theirs, I will add that she was slightly proud and exacting, and as constant in her affection towards a baseless opinion as towards an erring lover. The anxiety about sister Priscilla, which had grown rather active by the time the coral necklace was clasped, was happily ended by the entrance of that cheerful-looking lady herself, with a face made blowsy by cold and damp. After the first questions and greetings, she turned to Nancy and surveyed her from head to foot, then wheeled her round to ascertain that the back view was equally faultless. "What do you think of these gowns, Aunt Osgood?" said Priscilla, while Nancy helped her to unrobe. "Very handsome indeed, niece," said Mrs. Osgood, with a slight increase of formality. She always thought niece Priscilla too rough. "I'm obliged to have the same as Nancy, you know, for all I'm 5 years older, and it makes me look yellow, for she never will have anything without I have mine just like it, because she wants us to look like sisters. And I tell her, folks'll think it's my weakness makes me fancy I shall look pretty in what she looks pretty in. For I am ugly, there's no denying that. I feature my father's family. But law, I don't mind. Do you?" Priscilla here turned to the Miss Gunns, rattling on in too much preoccupation with the delight of talking to notice that her candour was not appreciated. "The pretty ones do for fly-catchers. They keep the men off us. I've no opinion of the men, Miss Gunn. I don't know what you have. And as for fretting and stewing about what they'll think of you from morning till night, and making your life uneasy about what they're doing when they're out of sight, as I tell Nancy, it's a folly no woman need be guilty of, if she's got a good father and a good home. Let her leave it to them as have got no fortune and can't help themselves. As I say, Mr. Have-your-own-way is the best husband, and the only one I'd ever promise to obey. I know it isn't pleasant, when you've been used to living in a big way and managing hogsheads and all that, to go and put your nose in by somebody else's fireside, or sit down by yourself to a scrag or a knuckle, but thank God my father's a sober man and likely to live. And if you've got a man by the chimney-corner, it doesn't matter if he's childish. The business needn't be broke up." The delicate process of getting her narrow gown over her head without injury to her smooth curls obliged Miss Priscilla to pause in this rapid survey of life, and Mrs. Osgood seized the opportunity of rising and saying, "Well, niece, you'll follow us? The Miss Gunns will like to go down?" "Sister," said Nancy, when they were alone, "you've offended the Miss Gunns, I'm sure." "What have I done, child?" said Priscilla, in some alarm. "Why, you asked them if they minded about being ugly. You're so very blunt." "Law, did I? Well, it popped out. It's a mercy I said no more, for I'm a bad un to live with folks if they don't like the truth. But as for being ugly, look at me, child, in this silver-coloured silk. I told you how it'd be. I look as yellow as a daffodil. Anybody'd say you wanted to make a mawkin of me." "No, Prissy, don't say so. I prayed and begged of you not to let us have this silk if you liked another better. I was willing to have your choice, you know I was," said Nancy, in anxious self-vindication. "Nonsense, child. You know you'd set your heart on this, and reason good, for you're the colour of cream. It'd be fine doings for you to dress yourself to suit my skin. What I find fault with is that notion of yours that I must dress just like you. But you do as you like with me, you always did, from when first you begun to walk. If you wanted to go the field's length you'd go, and there was no whipping you, for you looked as prim and innocent as a daisy all the while." "Prissy," said Nancy gently, as she fastened a coral necklace, exactly like her own, round Priscilla's neck, which was very far from being like her own, "I'm sure I'm willing to give way as far as is right, but who shouldn't dress alike if it isn't sisters? Would you have us go about looking as if we were no kin to one another, us that have got no mother, and not another sister in the world? I'd do what was right if I dressed in a gown dyed with cheese-colouring, and I'd rather you'd choose and let me wear what pleases you." "There you go again. You'd come round to the same thing if one talked to you from Saturday night till Saturday morning. It'll be fine fun to see how you'll master your husband, and never raise your voice above the singing of the kettle all the while. I'd like to see the men mastered." "Don't talk so, Prissy," said Nancy, blushing. "You know I don't mean ever to be married." "Oh, you never mean a fiddlestick's end," said Priscilla, as she arranged her discarded dress and closed her bandbox. "Who shall I have to work for when father's gone, if you are to go and take notions into your head and be an old maid, because some folks are no better than they should be? I haven't a bit of patience with you sitting over an addled egg for ever, as if there was never a fresh un in the world. One old maid's enough out of two sisters, and I shall do credit to a single life, for God Almighty meant me for it. Come, we can go down now. I'm as ready as a mawkin can be. There's nothing a-wanting to frighten the crows, now I've got my eardroppers in." As the two Miss Lammeters walked into the large parlour together, any one who did not know the character of both might certainly have supposed that the reason why the square-shouldered, clumsy, high-featured Priscilla wore a dress the facsimile of her pretty sister's was either the mistaken vanity of the one, or the malicious contrivance of the other, in order to set off her own rare beauty. But the good-natured, self-forgetful cheerfulness and common sense of Priscilla would soon have dissipated the one suspicion, and the modest calm of Nancy's speech and manners told clearly of a mind free from all disavowed devices. Places of honour had been kept for the Miss Lammeters near the head of the principal tea-table in the wainscoted parlour, now looking fresh and pleasant with handsome branches of holly, yew, and laurel from the abundant growth of the old garden, and Nancy felt an inward flutter that no firmness of purpose could prevent when she saw Mr. Godfrey Cass advancing to lead her to a seat between himself and Mr. Crackenthorp, while Priscilla was called to the opposite side between her father and the squire. It certainly did make some difference to Nancy that the lover she had given up was the young man of quite the highest consequence in the parish, at home in a venerable and unique parlour, which was the extremity of grandeur in her experience. A parlour where she might one day have been mistress, with the consciousness that she was spoken of as Madam Cass, the squire's wife. These circumstances exalted her inward drama in her own eyes, and deepened the emphasis with which she declared to herself that not the most dazzling rank should induce her to marry a man whose conduct showed him careless of his character, but that love once, love always was the motto of a true and pure woman, and no man should ever have any right over her which would be a call on her to destroy the dried flowers that she treasured, and always would treasure, for Godfrey Cass's sake. And Nancy was capable of keeping her word to herself under very trying conditions. Nothing but a becoming blush betrayed the moving thoughts that urged themselves upon her as she accepted the seat next to Mr. Crackenthorp, for she was so instinctively neat and adroit in all her actions, and her pretty lips met each other with such quiet firmness, that it would have been difficult for her to appear agitated. It was not the rector's practice to let a charming blush pass without an appropriate compliment. He was not in the least lofty or aristocratic, but simply a merry-eyed, small-featured, grey-haired man, with his chin propped by an ample, many-creased white neckcloth, which seemed to predominate over every other point in his person, and somehow to impress its peculiar character on his remarks, so that to have considered his amenities apart from his cravat would have been a severe and perhaps dangerous effort of abstraction. "Ah, Miss Nancy," he said, turning his head within his cravat and smiling down pleasantly upon her, "when anybody pretends this has been a severe winter, I shall tell them I saw the roses blooming on New Year's Eve. Eh, Godfrey, what do you say?" Godfrey made no reply, and avoided looking at Nancy very markedly, for though these complimentary personalities were held to be in excellent taste in old-fashioned Raveloe society, reverent love has a politeness of its own which it teaches to men otherwise of small schooling. But the squire was rather impatient at Godfrey showing himself a dull spark in this way. By this advanced hour of the day the squire was always in higher spirits than we have seen him in at the breakfast-table, and felt it quite pleasant to fulfil the hereditary duty of being noisily jovial and patronizing. The large silver snuff-box was in active service, and was offered without fail to all neighbours from time to time, however often they might have declined the favour. At present the squire had only given an express welcome to the heads of families as they appeared, but always as the evening deepened his hospitality rayed out more widely, till he had tapped the youngest guests on the back and shown a peculiar fondness for their presence, in the full belief that they must feel their lives made happy by their belonging to a parish where there was such a hearty man as Squire Cass to invite them and wish them well. Even in this early stage of the jovial mood, it was natural that he should wish to supply his son's deficiencies by looking and speaking for him. "Aye, aye," he began, offering his snuff-box to Mr. Lammeter, who, for the second time, bowed his head and waved his hand in stiff rejection of the offer. "Us old fellows may wish ourselves young to-night, when we see the mistletoe bough in the white parlour. It's true most things are going backward in these last 30 years. The country's going down since the old king fell ill. But when I look at Miss Nancy here, I begin to think the lasses keep up their quality. Ding me if I remember a sample to match her. Not when I was a fine young fellow and thought a deal about my pigtail. Oh, no offence to you, madam," he added, bending to Mrs. Crackenthorpe, who sat by him. "I didn't know you when you was as young as Miss Nancy here." Mrs. Crackenthorpe, a small blinking woman, who fidgeted incessantly with her lace, ribbons, and gold chain, turning her head about and making subdued noises, very much like a guinea pig that twitches its nose and soliloquizes in all company indiscriminately, now blinked and fidgeted towards the squire, and said, "Oh, no, no offence." This emphatic compliment of the squire's to Nancy was felt by others besides Godfrey to have a diplomatic significance, and her father gave a slight additional erectness to his back as he looked across the table at her with complacent gravity. That grave and orderly senior was not going to bate a jot of his dignity by seeming elated at the notion of a match between his family and the squire's. He was gratified by any honour paid to his daughter, but he must see an alteration in several ways before his consent would be vouchsafed. His spare but healthy person, and high-featured firm face that looked as if it had never been flushed by excess, was in strong contrast, not only with the squire's, but with the appearance of the Raveloe farmers generally, in accordance with a favourite saying of his own, that breed was stronger than pasture. "Miss Nancy's wonderful like what her mother was, though, isn't she, Kimble?" said the stout lady of that name, looking round for her husband. But Dr. Kimble, country apothecaries in old days enjoyed that title without authority of diploma, being a thin and agile man, was flitting about the room with his hands in his pockets, making himself agreeable to his feminine patients with medical impartiality, and being welcomed everywhere as a doctor by hereditary right, not one of these miserable apothecaries who canvass for practice in strange neighbourhoods, and spend all their income in starving their one horse, but a man of substance, able to keep an extravagant table like the best of his patients. Time out of mind, the Raveloe doctor had been a Kimble. Kimble was inherently a doctor's name, and it was difficult to contemplate firmly the melancholy fact that the actual Kimble had no son, so that his practice might one day be handed over to a successor with the incongruous name of Taylor or Johnson. But in that case the wiser people in Raveloe would employ Dr. Blick of Flitton as less unnatural. "Did you speak to me, my dear?" said the authentic doctor, coming quickly to his wife's side. But, as if foreseeing that she would be too much out of breath to repeat her remark, he went on immediately. "Ah, Miss Priscilla, the sight of you revives the taste of that super-excellent pork pie. I hope the batch isn't near an end." "Yes, indeed it is, doctor," said Priscilla, "but I'll answer for it the next shall be as good. My pork pies don't turn out well by chance." "Not as your doctoring does, eh, Kimble? Because folks forget to take your physic, eh?" said the squire, who regarded physic and doctors as many loyal churchmen regarded the church and the clergy, tasting a joke against them when he was in health, but impatiently eager for their aid when anything was the matter with him. He tapped his box and looked round with a triumphant laugh. "Ah, she has a quick wit, my friend Priscilla has," said the doctor, choosing to attribute the epigram to a lady, rather than allow a brother-in-law that advantage over him. "She saves a little pepper to sprinkle over her talk. That's the reason why she never puts too much into her pies. There's my wife now. She never has an answer at her tongue's end, but if I offend her, she's sure to scarify my throat with black pepper the next day, or else give me the colic with watery greens. Oh, that's an awful tit for tat." Here the vivacious doctor made a pathetic grimace. "Did you ever hear the like?" said Mrs. Kimble, laughing above her double chin with much good humour, aside to Mrs. Crackenthorpe, who blinked and nodded, and seemed to intend a smile, which, by the correlation of forces, went off in small twitchings and noises. "I suppose that's the sort of tit-for-tat adopted in your profession, Kimble, if you've a grudge against a patient," said the rector. "Never do have a grudge against our patients," said Mr. Kimble, "except when they leave us, and then, you see, we haven't the chance of prescribing for 'em. Ah, Miss Nancy," he continued, suddenly skipping to Nancy's side, "you won't forget your promise? You're to save a dance for me, you know." "Come, come, Kimble, don't you be too forward," said the squire. "Give the young uns fair play. There's my son Godfrey'll be wanted to have a round with you if you run off with Miss Nancy. He's bespoke her for the first dance, I'll be bound. Eh, sir? What do you say?" he continued, throwing himself backward and looking at Godfrey. "Haven't you asked Miss Nancy to open the dance with you?" Godfrey, sorely uncomfortable under this significant insistence about Nancy, and afraid to think where it would end by the time his father had set his usual hospitable example of drinking before and after supper, saw no course open but to turn to Nancy and say, with as little awkwardness as possible, "No, I've not asked her yet, but I hope she'll consent, if somebody else hasn't been before me." "No, I've not engaged myself," said Nancy quietly, though blushingly. If Mr. Godfrey founded any hopes on her consenting to dance with him, he would soon be undeceived, but there was no need for her to be uncivil. "Then I hope you'll have no objections to dance with me," said Godfrey, beginning to lose the sense that there was anything uncomfortable in this arrangement. "No, no objections," said Nancy in a cold tone. "Ah, well, you are a lucky fellow, Godfrey," said Uncle Kimble. "But you're my godson, so I won't stand in your way. Else I'm not so very old, eh, my dear?" he went on, skipping to his wife's side again. "You wouldn't mind my having a second after you are gone, not if I cried a good deal first." "Come, come, take a cup of tea and stop your tongue, do," said good-humoured Mrs. Kimble, feeling some pride in a husband who must be regarded as so clever and amusing by the company generally, if he had only not been irritable at cards. While safe, well-tested personalities were enlivening the tea in this way, the sound of the fiddle approaching within a distance at which it could be heard distinctly made the young people look at each other with sympathetic impatience for the end of the meal. "Why, there's Solomon in the hall," said the squire, "and playing my favourite tune. I believe the flaxen-headed ploughboy. He's for giving us a hint as we aren't in enough of a hurry to hear him play. Bob," he called out to his third long-legged son, who was at the other end of the room, "open the door and tell Solomon to come in. He shall give us a tune here." Bob obeyed, and Solomon walked in, fiddling as he walked, for he would on no account break off in the middle of a tune. "Here, Solomon," said the squire, with loud patronage. "Round here, my man. Ah, I knew it was a flaxen-headed ploughboy. There's no finer tune." Solomon Macey, a small, hale old man with an abundant crop of long white hair, reaching nearly to his shoulders, advanced to the indicated spot, bowing reverently while he fiddled, as much as to say that he respected the company, though he respected the keynote more. As soon as he had repeated the tune and lowered his fiddle, he bowed again to the squire and the rector, and said, "I hope I see your honour and your reverence well, and wishing you health and long life and happy New Year. And wishing the same to you, Mr. Lammeter, sir, and to the other gentlemen and madams, and the young lasses." As Solomon uttered these last words, he bowed in all directions solicitously, lest he should be wanting in due respect. But thereupon he immediately began to prelude, and fell into the tune which he knew would be taken as a special compliment by Mr. Lammeter. "Thank ye, Solomon, thank ye," said Mr. Lammeter, when the fiddle paused again. "That's over the hills and far away, that is. My father used to say to me, whenever we heard that tune, 'Ah, lad, I came from over the hills and far away.' There's a many tunes I don't make head or tail of, but that speaks to me like a blackbird's whistle. I suppose it's the name. There's a deal in the name of a tune." But Solomon was already impatient to prelude again, and presently broke with much spirit into Sir Roger de Coverley, at which there was a sound of chairs pushed back and laughing voices. "Aye, aye, Solomon, we know what that means," said the squire, rising. "It's time to begin the dance, eh? Lead the way, then, and we'll all follow you." So Solomon, holding his white head on one side and playing vigorously, marched forward at the head of the gay procession into the white parlour, where the mistletoe bough was hung, and multitudinous tallow candles made rather a brilliant effect, gleaming from among the buried holly boughs, and reflected in the old-fashioned oval mirrors fastened in the panels of the white wainscot. A quaint procession. Old Solomon, in his seedy clothes and long white locks, seemed to be luring that decent company by the magic screams of his fiddle, luring discreet matrons in turban-shaped caps, nay, Mrs. Crackenthorp herself, the summit of whose perpendicular feather was on a level with the squire's shoulder, luring fair lasses complacently conscious of very short waists and skirts blameless of front folds, luring burly fathers in large variegated waistcoats, and ruddy sons, for the most part shy and sheepish, in short nether garments and very long coat-tails. Already Mr. Macey and a few other privileged villagers, who were allowed to be spectators on these great occasions, were seated on benches placed for them near the door, and great was the admiration and satisfaction in that quarter when the couples had formed themselves for the dance, and the squire led off with Mrs. Crackenthorp, joining hands with the rector and Mrs. Osgood. That was as it should be. That was what everybody had been used to, and the character of Raveloe seemed to be renewed by the ceremony. It was not thought of as an unbecoming levity for the old and middle-aged people to dance a little before sitting down to cards, but rather as part of their social duties. For what were these if not to be merry at appropriate times, interchanging visits and poultry with due frequency, paying each other old established compliments in sound traditional phrases, passing well-tried personal jokes, urging your guests to eat and drink too much out of hospitality, and eating and drinking too much in your neighbour's house to show that you liked your cheer. And the parson naturally set an example in these social duties, for it would not have been possible for the Raveloe mind, without a peculiar revelation, to know that a clergyman should be a pale-faced memento of solemnities, instead of a reasonably faulty man whose exclusive authority to read prayers and preach, to christen, marry, and bury you, necessarily coexisted with the right to sell you the ground to be buried in, and to take tithe in kind, on which last point, of course, there was a little grumbling, but not to the extent of irreligion, not of deeper significance than the grumbling at the rain, which was by no means accompanied with a spirit of impious defiance, but with a desire that the prayer for finer weather might be read forthwith. There was no reason, then, why the rector's dancing should not be received as part of the fitness of things, quite as much as the squire's, or why, on the other hand, Mr. Macey's official respect should restrain him from subjecting the parson's performance to that criticism with which minds of extraordinary acuteness must necessarily contemplate the doings of their fallible fellow-men. "The squire's pretty springe, considering his weight," said Mr. Macey, "and he steps uncommon well. But Mr. Lammeter beats 'em all for shapes. You see, he holds his head like a sojer, and he isn't so cushiony as most of the oldish gentlefolk. They run to fat in general, and he's got a fine leg. The parson's nimble enough, but he hasn't got much of a leg. It's a bit too thick down'ard, and his knees might be a bit nearer without damage. But he might do worse, Though he hasn't that grand way of waving his hand as the squire has." "Talking nimbleness, look at Mrs. Osgood," said Ben Winthrop, who was holding his son Aaron between his knees. "She trips along with her little steps so as nobody can see how she goes. It's like as if she had little wheels to her feet. She doesn't look a day older nor last year. She's the finest made woman as is, let the next be where she will." "I don't heed how the women are made," said Mr. Macey with some contempt. "They wear neither coats nor breeches. You can't make much out of their shapes." "Feyther," said Aaron, whose feet were busy beating out the tune, "how does that big cock's feather stick in Mrs. Crackenthorp's yet? Is there a little hole for it, like in my shuttlecock?" "Hush, lad, hush! That's the way the ladies dress theirselves, that is," said the father. adding, however, in an undertone to Mr. Macey, "It does make her look funny, though, partly like a short-necked bottle with a long quill in it. By jingo, there's the young squire leading off now with Miss Nancy for partners. There's a lass for you, like a pink and white posy. There's nobody 'ud think as anybody could be so pretty. I shouldn't wonder if she's Madam Cass some day, after all, and nobody more rightfuller, for they'd make a fine match. You can't find nothing against Master Godfrey's shapes, Macey, I'll bet a penny." Mr. Macey screwed up his mouth, leaned his head further on one side, and twirled his thumbs with a presto movement, as his eyes followed Godfrey up the dance. At last he summed up his opinion. "Pretty well down'ard, but a bit too round at the shoulder blades. And as for them coats as he gets from the flitting tailor, they're a poor cut to pay double money for." "Ah, Mr. Macey, you and me are two folks," said Ben, slightly indignant at this carping. "When I got a pot of good ale, I like to swaller it and do my inside good, instead of smelling and staring at it to see if I can't find fault with the brewing. I should like you to pick out a finer limbed young fellow nor Master Godfrey, one as 'ud knock you down easier, or is more pleasanter looks when he's pert and merry." "Tchuh," said Mr. Macey, provoked to increased severity. "He isn't come to his right colour yet. He's partly like a slack-baked pie. Man, I doubt he's got a soft place in his head, else why should he be turned round the finger by that awful Dunsey as nobody's seen o' late, and let him kill that fine hunting horse as was the talk o' the country, and one while he's always after Miss Nancy, and then it all went off again, like the smell o' hot porridge, as I may say? That wasn't my way when I went a-courting." "Ah, but perhaps Miss Nancy hung off like, and your lass didn't," said Ben. "I should say she didn't," said Mr. Macey significantly. "Before I said sniff, I took care to know as she'd say snaff, and pretty quick too. I wasn't a-going to open my mouth like a dog at a fly, and snap it to again with nothing to swaller." "Well, I think Miss Nancy's a-coming round again," said Ben, "for Master Godfrey doesn't look so downhearted to-night. And I see he's for taking her away to sit down, now they're at the end of the dance. That looks like sweethearting, that does." The reason why Godfrey and Nancy had left the dance was not so tender as Ben imagined. In the close press of couples, a slight accident had happened to Nancy's dress, which, while it was short enough to show her neat ankle in front, was long enough behind to be caught under the stately stamp of the squire's foot, so as to rend certain stitches at the waist and cause much sisterly agitation in Priscilla's mind, as well as serious concern in Nancy's. One's thoughts may be much occupied with love struggles, but hardly so as to be insensible to a disorder in the general framework of things. Nancy had no sooner completed her duty in the figure they were dancing than she said to Godfrey, with a deep blush, that she must go and sit down till Priscilla could come to her, for the sisters had already exchanged a short whisper and an open-eyed glance full of meaning. No reason less urgent than this could have prevailed on Nancy to give Godfrey this opportunity of sitting apart with her. As for Godfrey, he was feeling so happy and oblivious under the long charm of the country dance with Nancy, that he got rather bold on the strength of her confusion, and was capable of leading her straight away, without leave asked, into the adjoining small parlour, where the card tables were set. "Oh, no, thank you," said Nancy coldly, as soon as she perceived where he was going. "Not in there. I'll wait here till Priscilla's ready to come to me. I'm sorry to bring you out of the dance and make myself troublesome." "Why, you'll be more comfortable here by yourself," said the artful Godfrey. "I'll leave you here till your sister can come." He spoke in an indifferent tone. That was an agreeable proposition, and just what Nancy desired. Why then was she a little hurt that Mr. Godfrey should make it? They entered, and she seated herself on a chair against one of the card tables, as the stiffest and most unapproachable position she could choose. "Thank you, sir," she said immediately. "I needn't give you any more trouble. I'm sorry you've had such an unlucky partner." "That's very ill-natured of you," said Godfrey, standing by her without any sign of intended departure. "To be sorry you've danced with me." "Oh, no, sir, I don't mean to say what's ill-natured at all," said Nancy, looking distractingly prim and pretty. "When gentlemen have so many pleasures, one dance can matter but very little." "You know that isn't true. You know one dance with you matters more to me than all the other pleasures in the world." It was a long, long while since Godfrey had said anything so direct as that, and Nancy was startled. But her instinctive dignity and repugnance to any show of emotion made her sit perfectly still, and only throw a little more decision into her voice as she said, "No, indeed, Mr. Godfrey, that's not known to me, and I have very good reason for thinking different. But if it's true, I don't wish to hear it." "Would you never forgive me then, Nancy? Never think well of me, let what would happen? Would you never think the present made amends for the past? Not if I turned a good fellow, and gave up everything you don't like?" Godfrey was half conscious that this sudden opportunity of speaking to Nancy alone had driven him beside himself, but blind feeling had got the mastery of his tongue. Nancy felt much agitated by the possibility Godfrey's words suggested, but this very pressure of emotion that she was in danger of finding too strong for her roused all her power of self-command. "I should be glad to see a good change in anybody, Mr. Godfrey," she answered, with the slightest discernible difference of tone. "But it'd be better if no change was wanted." "You're very hard-hearted, Nancy," said Godfrey pettishly. "You might encourage me to be a better fellow. I'm very miserable, but you've no feeling." "I think those have the least feeling that act wrong to begin with," said Nancy, sending out a flash in spite of herself. Godfrey was delighted with that little flash, and would have liked to go on and make her quarrel with him. Nancy was so exasperatingly quiet and firm, but she was not indifferent to him yet, though. The entrance of Priscilla, bustling forward and saying, "Dear heart alive, child, let us look at this gown," cut off Godfrey's hopes of a quarrel. "I suppose I must go now," he said to Priscilla. "It's no matter to me whether you go or stay," said that frank lady, searching for something in her pocket with a preoccupied brow. "Do you want me to go?" said Godfrey, looking at Nancy, who was now standing up by Priscilla's order. "As you like," said Nancy, trying to recover all her former coldness, and looking down carefully at the hem of her gown. "Then I like to stay," said Godfrey, with a reckless determination to get as much of this joy as he could to-night, and think nothing of the morrow. End of Chapter 11. Chapter 12. While Godfrey Cass was taking draughts of forgetfulness from the sweet presence of Nancy, willingly losing all sense of that hidden bond which at other moments galled and fretted him so as to mingle irritation with the very sunshine, Godfrey's wife was walking with slow, uncertain steps through the snow-covered Raveloe lanes, carrying her child in her arms. This journey on New Year's Eve was a premeditated act of vengeance which she had kept in her heart ever since Godfrey, in a fit of passion, had told her he would sooner die than acknowledge her as his wife. There would be a great party at the Red House on New Year's Eve, she knew. Her husband would be smiling and smiled upon, hiding her existence in the darkest corner of his heart. But she would mar his pleasure. She would go in her dingy rags, with her faded face once as handsome as the best, with her little child that had its father's hair and eyes, and disclose herself to the squire as his eldest son's wife. It is seldom that the miserable can help regarding their misery as a wrong inflicted by those who are less miserable. Molly knew that the cause of her dingy rags was not her husband's neglect, but the demon opium to whom she was enslaved, body and soul, except in the lingering mother's tenderness that refused to give him her hungry child. She knew this well, and yet in the moments of wretched unbenumbed consciousness the sense of her want and degradation transformed itself continually into bitterness towards Godfrey. He was well off, and if she had her rights she would be well off too. The belief that he repented his marriage and suffered from it only aggravated her vindictiveness. Just and self-reproving thoughts do not come to us too thickly, even in the purest air, and with the best lessons of heaven and earth. How should those white-winged delicate messengers make their way to Molly's poisoned chamber, inhabited by no higher memories than those of a barmaid's paradise of pink ribbons and gentlemen's jokes? She had set out at an early hour, but had lingered on the road, inclined by her indolence to believe that if she waited under a warm shed the snow would cease to fall. She had waited longer than she knew, and now that she found herself belated in the snow-hidden ruggedness of the long lanes, even the animation of a vindictive purpose could not keep her spirit from failing. It was 7 o'clock, and by this time she was not very far from Raveloe, but she was not familiar enough with those monotonous lanes to know how near she was to her journey's end. She needed comfort, and she knew but one comforter, the familiar demon in her bosom. But she hesitated a moment after drawing out the black remnant, before she raised it to her lips. In that moment the mother's love pleaded for painful consciousness rather than oblivion, pleaded to be left in aching weariness rather than to have the encircling arms benumbed so that they could not feel the dear burden. In another moment Molly had flung something away, but it was not the black remnant, it was an empty phial, and she walked on again under the breaking cloud, from which there came now and then the light of a quickly veiled star, for a freezing wind had sprung up since the snowing had ceased. But she walked always more and more drowsily, and clutched more and more automatically the sleeping child at her bosom. Slowly the demon was working his will, and cold and weariness were his helpers. Soon she felt nothing but a supreme immediate longing that curtained off all futurity, the longing to lie down and sleep. She had arrived at a spot where her footsteps were no longer checked by a hedgerow, and she had wandered vaguely, unable to distinguish any objects, notwithstanding the wide whiteness around her and the growing starlight. She sank down against the straggling furze bush, an easy pillow enough, and the bed of snow too was soft. She did not feel that the bed was cold, and did not heed whether the child would wake and cry for her. But her arms had not yet relaxed their instinctive clutch, and the little one slumbered on as gently as if it had been rocked in a lace-trimmed cradle. But the complete torpor came at last. The fingers lost their tension, the arms unbent. Then the little head fell away from the bosom, and the blue eyes opened wide on the cold starlight. At first there was a little peevish cry of "Mammy," and an effort to regain the pillowing arm and bosom. But Mammy's ear was deaf, and the pillow seemed to be slipping away backward. Suddenly, as the child rolled downward on its mother's knees, all wet with snow, its eyes were caught by a bright glancing light on the white ground, and, with the ready transition of infancy, it was immediately absorbed in watching the bright living thing running towards it, yet never arriving. That bright living thing must be caught, and in an instant the child had slipped on all fours and held out one little hand to catch the gleam. But the gleam could not be caught in that way, and now the head was held up to see where the cunning gleam came from. It came from a very bright place, and the little one, rising on its legs, toddled through the snow, with the old grimy shawl in which it was wrapped trailing behind it, and the queer little bonnet dangling at its back, toddled on to the open door of Silas Marner's cottage, and right up to the warm hearth, where there was a bright fire of logs and sticks, which had thoroughly warmed the old sack, Silas's greatcoat, spread out on the bricks to dry. The little one, accustomed to be left to itself for long hours without notice from its mother, squatted down on the sack and spread its tiny hands towards the blaze, in perfect contentment, gurgling and making many inarticulate communications to the cheerful fire, like a new-hatched gosling beginning to find itself comfortable. But presently the warmth had a lulling effect, and the little golden head sank down on the old sack, and the blue eyes were veiled by their delicate, half-transparent lids. But where was Silas Marner while this strange visitor had come to his hearth? He was in the cottage, but he did not see the child. During the last few weeks, since he had lost his money, he had contracted the habit of opening his door and looking out from time to time, as if he thought that his money might be somehow coming back to him, or that some trace, some news of it, might be mysteriously on the road and be caught by the listening ear or the straining eye. It was chiefly at night, when he was not occupied in his loom, that he fell into this repetition of an act for which he could have assigned no definite purpose, and which can hardly be understood except by those who have undergone a bewildering separation from a supremely loved object. In the evening twilight, and later, whenever the night was not dark, Silas looked out on that narrow prospect round the stone pits, listening and gazing, not with hope, but with mere yearning and unrest. This morning he had been told by some of his neighbours that it was New Year's Eve, and that he must sit up to hear the old year rung out and the new rung in, because that was good luck, and might bring his money back again. This was only a friendly Raveloe way of jesting with the half-crazy oddities of a miser, but it had perhaps helped to throw Silas into a more than usually excited state. Since the oncoming of twilight he had opened his door again and again, though only to shut it immediately at seeing all distance veiled by the falling snow. But the last time he opened it the snow had ceased, and the clouds were parting here and there. He stood and listened, and gazed for a long while. There was really something on the road coming towards him then, but he caught no sign of it, and the stillness and the wide trackless snow seemed to narrow his solitude, and touched his yearning with a chill of despair. He went in again, and put his right hand on the latch of the door to close it, but he did not close it. He was arrested, as he had been already since his loss, by the invisible wand of catalepsy, and stood like a graven image, with wide but sightless eyes, holding open his door, powerless to resist either the good or the evil that might enter there. When Marner's sensibilities returned, he continued the action which had been arrested, and closed his door, unaware of the chasm in his consciousness, unaware of any intermediate change, except that the light had grown dim, and that he was chilled and faint. He thought he had been too long standing at the door and looking out. Turning towards the hearth, where the two logs had fallen apart and sent forth only a red uncertain glimmer, he seated himself on his fireside chair, and was stooping to push his logs together, when, to his blurred vision, it seemed as if there were gold on the floor in front of the hearth. Gold, his own gold, brought back to him as mysteriously as it had been taken away. He felt his heart begin to beat violently, and for a few moments he was unable to stretch out his hand and grasp the restored treasure. The heap of gold seemed to glow and get larger beneath his agitated gaze. He leaned forward at last and stretched forth his hand, but instead of the hard coin with the familiar resisting outline, his fingers encountered soft warm curls. In utter amazement Silas fell on his knees and bent his head low to examine the marvel. It was a sleeping child, a round fair thing with soft yellow rings all over its head. Could this be the little sister come back to him in a dream? His little sister whom he had carried about in his arms for a year before she died, when he was a small boy without shoes or stockings. That was the first thought that darted across Silas's blank wonderment. Was it a dream? He rose to his feet again, pushed his logs together, and throwing on some dried leaves and sticks, raised a flame. But the flame did not disperse the vision. It only lit up more distinctly the little round form of the child and its shabby clothing. It was very much like his little sister. Silas sank into his chair powerless, under the double presence of an inexplicable surprise and a hurrying influx of memories. How and when had the child come in without his knowledge? He had never been beyond the door. But along with that question, and almost thrusting it away, there was a vision of the old home and the old streets leading to Lantern Yard, and within that vision another of the thoughts which had been present with him in those far-off scenes. The thoughts were strange to him now, like old friendships impossible to revive, and yet he had a dreamy feeling that this child was somehow a message come to him from that far-off life. It stirred fibres that had never been moved in Raveloe, old quiverings of tenderness, old impressions of awe at the presentiment of some power presiding over his life. For his imagination had not yet extricated itself from the sense of mystery in the child's sudden presence, and had formed no conjectures of ordinary natural means by which the event could have been brought about. But there was a cry on the hearth. The child had awaked, and Marner stooped to lift it on his knee. It clung round his neck and burst louder and louder into that mingling of inarticulate cries with "mammy," by which little children express the bewilderment of waking. Silas pressed it to him, and almost unconsciously uttered sounds of hushing tenderness, while he bethought himself that some of his porridge, which had got cool by the dying fire, would do to feed the child with if it were warmed up a little. He had plenty to do through the next hour. The porridge, sweetened with some dry brown sugar from an old store which he had refrained from using for himself, stopped the cries of the little one, and made her lift her blue eyes with a wide, quiet gaze at Silas as he put the spoon into her mouth. Presently she slipped from his knee and began to toddle about, but with a pretty stagger that made Silas jump up and follow her lest she should fall against anything that would hurt her. But she only fell in a sitting posture on the ground, and began to pull at her boots, looking up at him with a crying face as if the boots hurt her. He took her on his knee again, But it was some time before it occurred to Silas's dull bachelor mind that the wet boots were the grievance, pressing on her warm ankles. He got them off with difficulty, and baby was at once happily occupied with the primary mystery of her own toes, inviting Silas, with much chuckling, to consider the mystery too. But the wet boots had at last suggested to Silas that the child had been walking on the snow, and this roused him from his entire oblivion of any ordinary means by which it could have entered or been brought into his house. Under the prompting of this new idea, and without waiting to form conjectures, he raised the child in his arms and went to the door. As soon as he had opened it, there was the cry of "Mammy" again, which Silas had not heard since the child's first hungry waking. Bending forward, he could just discern the marks made by the little feet on the virgin snow, and then followed their track to the furze bushes. "Mammy," the little one cried again and again, stretching itself forward so as almost to escape from Silas's arms, before he himself was aware that there was something more than the bush before him, that there was a human body, with a head sunk low in the furze, and half covered with the shaken snow. End of chapter 12. Chapter 13. It was after the early supper time at the Red House, and the entertainment was in that stage when bashfulness itself had passed into easy jollity, when gentlemen conscious of unusual accomplishments could at length be prevailed on to dance a hornpipe, and when the squire preferred talking loudly, scattering snuff, and patting his visitor's back, to sitting longer at the whist-table, a choice exasperating to Uncle Kimble, who, being always volatile in sober business hours, became intense and bitter over cards and brandy, shuffled before his adversary's deal with a glare of suspicion, and turned up a mean trump-card with an air of inexpressible disgust, as if, in a world where such things could happen, one might as well enter on a course of reckless profligacy. When the evening had advanced to this pitch of freedom and enjoyment, it was usual for the servants, the heavy duties of supper being well over, to get their share of amusement by coming to look on at the dancing, so that the back regions of the house were left in solitude. There were two doors by which the white parlour was entered from the hall, and they were both standing open for the sake of air, but the lower one was crowded with the servants and villagers, and only the upper doorway was left free. Bob Cass was figuring in a hornpipe, and his father, very proud of his lithe son, whom he repeatedly declared to be just like himself in his young days, in a tone that implied this to be the very highest stamp of juvenile merit, was the centre of a group who had placed themselves opposite the performer, not far from the upper door. Godfrey was standing a little way off, not to admire his brother's dancing, but to keep sight of Nancy, who was seated in the group near her father. He stood aloof because he wished to avoid suggesting himself as a subject for the squire's fatherly jokes in connection with matrimony and Miss Nancy Lammeter's beauty, which were likely to become more and more explicit. But he had the prospect of dancing with her again when the hornpipe was concluded, and in the meanwhile it was very pleasant to get long glances at her quite unobserved. But when Godfrey was lifting his eyes from one of those long glances, they encountered an object as startling to him at that moment as if it had been an apparition from the dead. It was an apparition from that hidden life which lies, like a dark by-street, behind the goodly ornamented façade that meets the sunlight and the gaze of respectable admirers. It was his own child, carried in Silas Marner's arms. That was his instantaneous impression, unaccompanied by doubt, though he had not seen the child for months past, and when the hope was rising that he might possibly be mistaken, Mr. Crackenthorp and Mr. Lammeter had already advanced to Silas, in astonishment at this strange advent. Godfrey joined them immediately, unable to rest without hearing every word, trying to control himself, but conscious that if any one noticed him, they must see that he was white-lipped and trembling. But now all eyes at that end of the room were bent on Silas Marner. The squire himself had risen, and asked angrily, "How's this? What's this? What do you do coming in here in this way?" "I'm come for the doctor. I want the doctor," Silas had said in the first moment to Mr. Crackenthorp. "Why, what's the matter, Marner?" said the rector. "The doctor's here, but say quietly what you want him for." "It's a woman," said Silas, speaking low and half breathlessly, just as Godfrey came up. "She's dead, I think. Dead in the snow at the stone pits, not far from my door." Godfrey felt a great throb. There was one terror in his mind at that moment. It was that the woman might not be dead. That was an evil terror, an ugly inmate to have found a nestling place in Godfrey's kindly disposition. But no disposition is a security from evil wishes to a man whose happiness hangs on duplicity. "Hush, hush," said Mr. Crackenthorp. "Go out into the hall there. I'll fetch the doctor for you. Found a woman in the snow and think she's dead," he added, speaking low to the squire. "Better say as little about it as possible. It will shock the ladies. Just tell them a poor woman is ill from cold and hunger. I'll go and fetch Kimble." By this time, however, the ladies had pressed forward, curious to know what could have brought the solitary linen weaver there under such strange circumstances, and interested in the pretty child, who, half alarmed and half attracted by the brightness and the numerous company, now frowned and hid her face, now lifted up her head again and looked round placably, until a touch or a coaxing word brought back the frown, and made her bury her face with new determination. "What child is it?" said several ladies at once, and among the rest Nancy Lammeter, addressing Godfrey. "I don't know. Some poor woman's been found in the snow, I believe," was the answer Godfrey wrung from himself with a terrible effort. "After all, am I certain?" he hastened to add, silently, in anticipation of his own conscience. "Why, you'd better leave the child here then, Master Marner," said good-natured Mrs. Kimble, hesitating, however, to take those dingy clothes into contact with her own ornamented satin bodice. "I'll tell one of the girls to fetch it." "No, no, I can't part with it. I can't let it go," said Silas abruptly. "It's come to me. I've a right to keep it." The proposition to take the child from him had come to Silas quite unexpectedly, and his speech, uttered under a strong sudden impulse, was almost like a revelation to himself. A minute before he had no distinct intention about the child. "Did you ever hear the like?" said Mrs. Kimble, in mild surprise, to her neighbour. "Now, ladies, I must trouble you to stand aside," said Mr. Kimble, coming from the card-room, in some bitterness at the interruption, but drilled by the long habit of his profession into obedience to unpleasant calls, even when he was hardly sober. "It's a nasty business turning out now, eh, Kimble?" said the squire. "He might have gone for your young fellow, the apprentice there, what's his name?" "Might? Ah, what's the use of talking about might?" growled Uncle Kimble, hastening out with Marner, and followed by Mr. Crackenthorp and Godfrey. "Get me a pair of thick boots, Godfrey, will you? And stay, let somebody run to Winthrop's and fetch Dolly. She's the best woman to get. Ben was here himself before supper. Is he gone?" "Yes, sir, I met him," said Marner, "but I couldn't stop to tell him anything. Only I said I was going for the doctor, and he said the doctor was at the squire's, and I made haste and ran, and there was nobody to be seen at the back of the house, so I went into where the company was." The child, no longer distracted by the bright light and the smiling women's faces, began to cry and call for mammy, though always clinging to Marner, who had apparently won her thorough confidence. Godfrey had come back with the boots, and felt the cry as if some fibre were drawn tight within him. "I'll go," he said hastily, eager for some movement. "I'll go and fetch the woman, Mrs. Winthrop." "Oh, pooh! Send somebody else," said Uncle Kimble, hurrying away with Marner. "You'll let me know if I can be of any use, Kimble," said Mr. Crackenthorp, but the doctor was out of hearing. Godfrey too had disappeared. He was gone to snatch his hat and coat, having just reflection enough to remember that he must not look like a madman. But he rushed out of the house into the snow without heeding his thin shoes. In a few minutes he was on his rapid way to the stone pits by the side of Dolly, who, though feeling that she was entirely in her place in encountering cold and snow on an errand of mercy, was much concerned at a young gentleman's getting his feet wet under a like impulse. "You'd a deal better go back, sir," said Dolly with respectful compassion. "You've no call to catch cold. And I'd ask you if you'd be so good as to tell my husband to come on your way back. He's at the Rainbow, no doubt, if you find him anyway sober enough to be of use, or else does Mrs. Snell had happened to send up the boy to fetch and carry, for there may be things wanted from the doctor's." "No, I'll stay, now I'm once out. I'll stay outside here," said Godfrey, when they came opposite Marner's cottage. "You can come and tell me if I can do anything." "Well, sir, you're very good. You've a tender heart," said Dolly, going to the door. Godfrey was too painfully preoccupied to feel a twinge of self-reproach at this undeserved praise. He walked up and down, unconscious that he was plunging ankle-deep in snow, unconscious of everything but trembling suspense about what was going on in the cottage, and the effect of each alternative on his future lot. No, not quite unconscious of everything else. Deeper down, and half smothered by passionate desire and dread, there was the sense that he ought not to be waiting on those alternatives, that he ought to accept the consequences of his deeds, own the miserable wife, and fulfil the claims of the helpless child. But he had not moral courage enough to contemplate that active renunciation of Nancy as possible for him. He had only conscience and heart enough to make him forever uneasy under the weakness that forbade the renunciation. And at this moment his mind leapt away from all restraint towards a sudden prospect of deliverance from his long bondage. "Is she dead?" said the voice that predominated over every other within him. "If she is, I may marry Nancy, and then I shall be a good fellow in future, and have no secrets, and the child shall be taken care of somehow." But across that vision came the other possibility. "She may live, and then it's all up with me." Godfrey never knew how long it was before the door of the cottage opened and Mr. Kimble came out. He went forward to meet his uncle, prepared to suppress the agitation he must feel, whatever news he was to hear. "I waited for you, as I'd come so far," he said, speaking first. "Pooh! It was nonsense for you to come out. Why didn't you send one of the men? There's nothing to be done. She's dead. Has been dead for hours, I should say." "What sort of woman is she?" said Godfrey, feeling the blood rush to his face. "A young woman, but emaciated, with long black hair. Some vagrant, quite in rags. She's got a wedding ring on, however. They must fetch her away to the workhouse to-morrow. Come along." "I want to look at her," said Godfrey. "I think I saw such a woman yesterday. I'll overtake you in a minute or two." Mr. Kimble went on, and Godfrey turned back to the cottage. He cast only one glance at the dead face on the pillow, which Dolly had smoothed with decent care. But he remembered that last look at his unhappy, hated wife so well, that at the end of 16 years every line in the worn face was present to him when he told the full story of this night. He turned immediately towards the hearth, where Silas Marner sat lulling the child. She was perfectly quiet now, but not asleep, only soothed by sweet porridge and warmth into that wide gazing calm which makes us older human beings, with our inward turmoil, feel a certain awe in the presence of a little child, such as we feel before some quiet majesty or beauty in the earth or sky, before a steady glowing planet, or a full-flowered eglantine, or the bending trees over a silent pathway. The wide-open blue eyes looked up at Godfrey's without any uneasiness or sign of recognition. The child could make no visible audible claim to his father, and the father felt a strange mixture of feelings, a conflict of regret and joy, that the pulse of that little heart had no response for the half-jealous yearning in his own, when the blue eyes turned away from him slowly and fixed themselves on the weaver's queer face, which was bent low to look at them, while the small hand began to pull Marner's withered cheek with loving disfiguration. "You'll take the child to the parish to-morrow?" asked Godfrey, speaking as indifferently as he could. "Who says so?" said Marner sharply. "Will they make me take her?" "Why, you wouldn't like to keep her, should you? An old bachelor like you?" "Till anybody shows they've a right to take her away from me," said Marner. "The mother's dead, and I reckon it's got no father. It's a lone thing, and I'm a lone thing. My money's gone, I don't know where, and this came from I don't know where. I know nothing. I'm partly mazed." "Poor little thing," said Godfrey. "Let me give something towards finding it clothes." He had put his hand in his pocket and found half a guinea, and, thrusting it into Silas's hand, he hurried out of the cottage to overtake Mr. Kimble. "Ah, I see it's not the same woman I saw," he said, as he came up. "It's a pretty little child. The old fellow seems to want to keep it. That's strange for a miser like him, but I gave him a trifle to help him out. The parish isn't likely to quarrel with him for the right to keep the child." "No, but I've seen the time when I might have quarrelled with him for it myself. It's too late now, though. If the child ran into the fire, your aunt's too fat to overtake it. She could only sit and grunt like an alarmed sow. But what a fool you are, Godfrey, to come out in your dancing shoes and stockings in this way, and you one of the beaux of the evening, and at your own house. "What do you mean by such freaks, young fellow? Has Miss Nancy been cruel? And do you want to spite her by spoiling your pumps?" "Oh, everything has been disagreeable to-night. I was tired to death of jigging and gallanting, and that bother about the hornpipes. And I'd got to dance with the other Miss Gunn," said Godfrey, glad of the subterfuge his uncle had suggested to him. The prevarication and white lies which a mind that keeps itself ambitiously pure is as uneasy under as a great artist under the false touches that no eye detects but his own, are worn as lightly as mere trimmings when once the actions have become a lie. Godfrey reappeared in the white parlour with dry feet, and, since the truth must be told, with a sense of relief and gladness that was too strong for painful thoughts to struggle with. For could he not venture now, whenever opportunity offered, to say the tenderest things to Nancy Lammeter, to promise her and himself that he would always be just what she would desire to see him? There was no danger that his dead wife would be recognized. Those were not days of active inquiry and wide report. And as for the registry of their marriage, that was a long way off, buried in unturned pages, away from everyone's interest but his own. Dunsey might betray him if he came back, but Dunsey might be one to silence. And when events turn out so much better for a man than he has had reason to dread, is it not a proof that his conduct has been less foolish and blameworthy than it might otherwise have appeared? When we are treated well, we naturally begin to think that we are not altogether unmeritorious, and that it is only just that we should treat ourselves well, and not mar our own good fortune. Where, after all, would be the use of his confessing the past to Nancy Lammeter, and throwing away his happiness, nay, hers? For he felt some confidence that she loved him. As for the child, he would see that it was cared for. He would never forsake it. He would do everything but own it. Perhaps it would be just as happy in life without being owned by its father, seeing that nobody could tell how things would turn out. And that, is there any other reason wanted? Well then, that the father would be much happier without owning the child. End of chapter 13. Chapter 14. There was a pauper's burial that week in Raveloe, and up Kent Yard at Batherley it was known that the dark-haired woman with the fair child, who had lately come to lodge there, was gone away again. That was all the express note taken that Molly had disappeared from the eyes of men. But the unwept death, which to the general lot seemed as trivial as the summer shed leaf, was charged with the force of destiny to certain human lives that we know of, shaping their joys and sorrows even to the end. Silas Marner's determination to keep the tramp's child was matter of hardly less surprise and iterated talk in the village than the robbery of his money. That softening of feeling towards him which dated from his misfortune, that merging of suspicion and dislike in a rather contemptuous pity for him as lone and crazy, was now accompanied with a more active sympathy, especially amongst the women. Notable mothers who knew what it was to keep children whole and sweet, lazy mothers who knew what it was to be interrupted in folding their arms and scratching their elbows by the mischievous propensities of children just firm on their legs, were equally interested in conjecturing how a lone man would manage with a 2-year-old child on his hands, and were equally ready with their suggestions, the notable chiefly telling him what he had better do, and the lazy ones being emphatic in telling him what he would never be able to do. Among the notable mothers, Dolly Winthrop was the one whose neighbourly offices were the most acceptable to Marner, for they were rendered without any show of bustling instruction. Silas had shown her the half-guinea given to him by Godfrey, and asked her what should be done about getting some clothes for the child. Master Marner," said Dolly, "there's no call to buy no more nor a pair of shoes, for I've got the little petticoats as Aaron wore 5 years ago, and it's ill spending the money on them baby clothes, for the child'll grow like the grass in May, bless it, that it will." And the same day Dolly brought her bundle, and displayed to Marner, one by one, the tiny garments in their due order of succession, most of them patched and darned, but clean and neat as fresh-sprung herbs. This was the introduction to a great ceremony with soap and water, from which baby came out in a new beauty, and sat on Dolly's knee, handling her toes and chuckling, and patting her palms together with an air of having made several discoveries about herself, which she communicated by alternate sounds of gug, 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 and mammy, The mammy was not a cry of need or uneasiness. Baby had been used to utter it without expecting either tender sound or touch to follow. "Anybody 'ud think the angels in heaven couldn't be prettier," said Dolly, rubbing the golden curls and kissing them. "And to think of its being covered with them dirty rags. And the poor mother froze to death. But there's them as took care of it and brought it to your door, Master Marner. The door was open, and it walked in over the snow like as if it had been a little starved robin. Didn't you say the door was open?" "Yes," said Silas meditatively. "Yes, the door was open. The money's gone I don't know where, and this came from I don't know where." He had not mentioned to any one his unconsciousness of the child's entrance, shrinking from questions which might lead to the fact he himself suspected, namely, that he had been in one of his trances. "Ah," said Dolly, with soothing gravity, "it's like the night and the morning, and the sleeping and the waking, and the rain and the harvest. One goes and the other comes, and we know nothing how nor where. We may strive and scrat and fend, but it's little we can do after all. The big things come and go with no striving o' our own. They do, that they do. And I think you're in the right on it to keep the little un, Master Marner, seeing as it's been sent to you, though there's folks as thinks different. You'll happen be a bit moithered with it while it's so little, but I'll come and welcome and see to it for you. I've a bit of time to spare most days, for when one gets up betimes of the morning, the clock seems to stand still toward 10, afore it's time to go about the victual. So, as I say, I'll come and see to the child for you, and welcome." "Thank you, kindly," said Silas, hesitating a little. "I'll be glad if you'll tell me things, but—" he added uneasily, leaning forward to look at Baby with some jealousy, as she was resting her head backward against Dolly's arm, and eyeing him contentedly from a distance. "But I want to do things for it myself, else it may get fond of somebody else, and not fond of me. I've been used to fending for myself in the house. I can learn." "Eh, to be sure," said Dolly gently. "I've seen men as are wonderful handy with children. The men are awkward and contrary mostly, God help 'em, but when the drink's out of 'em they aren't unsensible, though they're bad for leeching and bandaging, so fiery and impatient. You see, this goes first next to the skin," proceeded Dolly, taking up the little shirt and putting it on. "Yes," said Marner docilely, bringing his eyes very close so that they might be initiated in the mysteries, whereupon Baby seized his head with both her small arms and put her lips against his face with purring noises. "See there," said Dolly, with a woman's tender tact, "she's fondest of you. She wants to go to your lap, I'll be bound. Go then, take her, Master Marner. You can put the things on, and then you can say as you've done for her from the first of her coming to you." Marner took her on his lap, trembling with an emotion mysterious to himself, at something unknown dawning on his life. Thought and feeling were so confused within him that if he had tried to give them utterance he could only have said that the child was come instead of the gold, that the gold had turned into the child. He took the garments from Dolly and put them on under her teaching, interrupted of course by Baby's gymnastics. "There then. Why, you make it quite easy, Master Marner," said Dolly. "But what shall you do when you're forced to sit in your loom? For she'll get busier and mischievouser every day. She will, bless her. It's lucky you've got that high hearth instead of a grate, for that keeps the fire more out of her reach. But if you've got anything as can be spilt or broke, or as is fit to cut her fingers off, she'll be at it, and it is but right you should know." Silas meditated a little while in some perplexity. "I'll tie her to the leg of the loom," he said at last. "Tie her with a good long strip o' something." "Well, mayhap that'll do, as it's a little girl, for they're easier persuaded to sit in one place nor the lads. I know what the lads are, for I've had four I've had, God knows, and if you was to take 'em and tie 'em up, they'd make a fighting and a crying as if you was ringing the pigs. But I'll bring you my little chair, and some bits of red rag and things for her to play with, and she'll sit and chatter to them as if they was alive. Eh, if it wasn't a sin to the lads to wish 'em made different, bless 'em, I should have been glad for one of 'em to be a little girl. And to think as I could ha' taught her to scour and mend, and the knitting and everything. But I can teach him to this little one, Master Marner, when she gets old enough." "But she'll be my little un," said Marner, rather hastily. "She'll be nobody else's." "No, to be sure, you'll have a right to her if you're a father to her, and bring her up according. But," added Dolly, coming to a point which she had determined beforehand to touch upon, "you must bring her up like christened folks' children, and take her to church, and let her learn the catechise, as my little Aaron can say off, the I believe and everything, and hurt nobody by word or deed, as well as if he was the clerk. That's what you must do, Master Marner, if you do the right thing by the orphan child." Marner's pale face flushed suddenly under a new anxiety. His mind was too busy trying to give some definite bearing to Dolly's words for him to think of answering her. "And it's my belief," she went on, "as the poor little creature has never been christened, and it's nothing but right as the parson should be spoke to. And if you was no ways unwilling, I'd talk to Mr. Macey about it this very day. For if the child ever went any ways wrong, and you hadn't done your part by it, Master Marner, inoculation and everything to save it from harm, it'd be a thorn in your bed for ever o' this side of the grave. And I can't think as it'd be easy lying down for anybody when they'd got to another world, if they hadn't done their part by the helpless children as come without their own asking." Dolly herself was disposed to be silent for some time now, for she had spoken from the depths of her own simple belief, and was much concerned to know whether her words would produce the desired effect upon Silas. He was puzzled and anxious, for Dolly's word "christened" conveyed no distinct meaning to him. He had only heard of baptism, and had only seen the baptism of grown-up men and women. "What is it you mean by christened?" he said at last, timidly. "Won't folks be good to her without it?" "Oh, dear, dear, Master Marner," said Dolly, with gentle distress and compassion. "Had you never no father nor mother as taught you to say your prayers, and as there's good words and good things to keep us from harm?" "Yes," said Silas in a low voice, "I know a deal about that. I used to. But your ways are different. My country was a good way off." He paused a few moments, and then added more decidedly, "But I want to do everything as can be done for the child, and whatever's right for it in this country, and you think it'll do her good, I'll act accordingly, if you'll tell me." "Well then, Master Marner," said Dolly, inwardly rejoiced, "I'll ask Mr. Macey to speak to the parson about it. And you must fix on a name for it, because it must have a name give it when it's christened." "My mother's name was Hepzibah," said Silas, "and my little sister was named after her." "Eh, that's a hard name," said Dolly. "I partly think it isn't a christened name." "It's a Bible name," said Silas, old ideas recurring. "Then I've no call to speak again it," said Dolly, rather startled by Silas's knowledge on this head. "But you see, I'm no scholar, and I'm slow at catching the words. My husband says I'm always acting as if I was putting the haft for the handle. That's what he says, for he's very sharp, God bless him. But it was awkward calling your little sister by such a hard name, when you've got nothing big to say, like, wasn't it, Master Marner?" "We called her Eppie," said Silas. "Well, if it was no ways wrong to shorten the name, it'd be a deal handier. And so I'll go now, Master Marner, and I'll speak about the christening afore dark, and I wish you the best o' luck. And it's my belief as it'll come to you if you do what's right by the orphan child. And there's the inoculation to be seen to. And as to washing its bits of things, you need look to nobody but me, for I can do 'em with one hand when I've got my suds about. Eh, the blessed angel! You let me bring my Aaron one of these days, and he'll show her his little cart as his father made for him, and the black and white pup as he's got a rearing." Baby was christened, the rector deciding that a double baptism was the lesser risk to incur; and on this occasion Silas, making himself as clean and tidy as he could, appeared for the first time within the church, and shared in the observances held sacred by his neighbours. He was quite unable, by means of anything he heard or saw, to identify the Raveloe religion with his old faith. If he could at any time in his previous life have done so, it must have been by the aid of a strong feeling ready to vibrate with sympathy, rather than by a comparison of phrases and ideas. And now, for long years, that feeling had been dormant. He had no distinct idea about the baptism and the church-going, except that Dolly had said it was for the good of the child. And in this way, as the weeks grew to months, the child created fresh and fresh links between his life and the lives from which he had hitherto shrunk continually into narrower isolation. Unlike the gold which needed nothing, and must be worshipped in close-locked solitude, which was hidden away from the daylight, was deaf to the song of birds, and started to no human tones, Eppie was a creature of endless claims and ever-growing desires, seeking and loving sunshine, and living sounds, and living movements, making trial of everything with trust in new joy, and stirring the human kindness in all eyes that looked on her. The gold had kept his thoughts in an ever-repeated circle, leading to nothing beyond itself. But Eppie was an object compacted of changes and hopes that forced his thoughts onward, and carried them far away from their old eager pacing towards the same blank limit, carry them away to the new things that would come with the coming years, when Eppie would have learned to understand how her father Silas cared for her, and made him look for images of that time in the ties and charities that bound together the families of his neighbours. The gold had asked that he should sit weaving longer and longer, deafened and blinded more and more to all things except the monotony of his loom and the repetition of his web. But Eppie called him away from his weaving, and made him think all its pauses a holiday, reawakening his senses with her fresh life, even to the old winter flies that came crawling forth in the early spring sunshine, and warming him into joy because she had joy. And when the sunshine grew strong and lasting, so that the buttercups were thick in the meadows, Silas might be seen in the sunny midday, or in the late afternoon when the shadows were lengthening under the hedgerows, strolling out with uncovered head to carry Eppie beyond the stone pits to where the flowers grew, till they reached some favourite bank where he could sit down while Eppie toddled to pluck the flowers, and make remarks to the winged things that murmured happily above the bright petals, calling Dad's attention continually by bringing him the flowers. Then she would turn her ear to some sudden bird note, and Silas learned to please her by making signs of hushed stillness, that they might listen for the note to come back again, so that when it came she set up her small back and laughed with gurgling triumph. Sitting on the banks in this way, Silas began to look for the once familiar herbs again, and as the leaves with their unchanged outline and markings lay on his palm, there was a sense of crowding remembrances from which he turned away timidly, taking refuge in Eppie's little world that lay lightly on his enfeebled spirit. As the child's mind was growing into knowledge, his mind was growing into memory. As her life unfolded, his soul, long stupefied in a cold, narrow prison, was unfolding too, and trembling gradually into full consciousness. It was an influence which must gather force with every new year. The tone that stirred Silas's heart grew articulate, and called for more distinct answers. Shapes and sounds grew clearer for Eppie's eyes and ears, and there was more that Dad was imperatively required to notice and account for. Also, by the time Eppie was 3 years old, she developed a fine capacity for mischief, and for devising ingenious ways of being troublesome, which found much exercise, not only for Silas's patience, but for his watchfulness and penetration. Sorely was poor Silas puzzled on such occasions by the incompatible demands of love. Dolly Winthrop told him that punishment was good for Eppie, and that, as for rearing a child without making it tingle a little in soft and safe places now and then, it was not to be done. "To be sure, there's another thing you might do, Master Marner," added Dolly meditatively. "You might shut her up once i' the coal-hole. That's what I did wi' Aaron, for I was that silly wi' the youngest lad as I could never bear to smack him. Not as I could find in my heart to let him stay i' the coal-hole more nor a minute, but it was enough to colly him all over, so as he must be new washed and dressed, and it was as good as a rod to him, that was. But I put it upo' your conscience, Master Marner, as there's one of 'em you must choose, either smacking or the coal-hole, else she'll get so masterful there'll be no hold on her." Silas was impressed with the melancholy truth of this last remark, but his force of mind failed before the only two penal methods open to him, not because it was painful to him to hurt Eppie, but because he trembled at a moment's contention with her, lest she should love him the less for it. Let even an affectionate Goliath get himself tied to a small tender thing, dreading to hurt it by pulling, and dreading still more to snap the cord, and which of the two, pray, will be master? It was clear that Eppie, with her short toddling steps, must lead Father Silas a pretty dance on any fine morning when circumstances favoured mischief. For example, he had wisely chosen a broad strip of linen as a means of fastening her to his loom when he was busy. It made a broad belt round her waist, and was long enough to allow of her reaching the truckle bed and sitting down on it, but not long enough for her to attempt any dangerous climbing. One bright summer's morning Silas had been more engrossed than usual in setting up a new piece of work, an occasion on which his scissors were in requisition. These scissors, owing to a special warning of Dolly's, had been kept carefully out of Eppie's reach, but the click of them had had a peculiar attraction for her ear, and watching the results of that click, she had derived the philosophical lesson that the same cause would produce the same effect. Silas had seated himself in his loom, and the noise of weaving had begun, but he had left his scissors on a ledge which Eppie's arm was long enough to reach, and now, like a small mouse watching her opportunity, she stole quietly from her corner, secured the scissors, and toddled to the bed again, setting up her back as a mode of concealing the fact. She had a distinct intention as to the use of the scissors, and having cut the linen strip in a jagged but effectual manner, in 2 moments she had run out the open door where the sunshine was inviting her, while poor Silas believed her to be a better child than usual. It was not until he happened to need his scissors that the terrible fact burst upon him. Eppie had run out by herself, had perhaps fallen into the stone pit. Silas, shaken by the worst fear that could have befallen him, rushed out, calling "Eppie!" and ran eagerly about the unenclosed space, exploring the dry cavities into which she might have fallen, and then gazing with questioning dread at the smooth red surface of the water. The cold drops stood on his brow. How long had she been out? There was one hope, that she had crept through the stile and got into the fields where he habitually took her to stroll. But the grass was high in the meadow, and there was no descrying her if she was there, except by a close search that would be a trespass on Mr. Osgood's crop. Still, that misdemeanour must be committed, and poor Silas, after peering all round the hedgerows, traversed the grass, beginning with perturbed vision to see Eppie behind every group of red sorrel, and to see her moving always farther off as he approached. The meadow was searched in vain, and he got over the stile into the next field, looking with dying hope towards a small pond which was now reduced to its summer shallowness, so as to leave a wide margin of good adhesive mud. Here, however, sat Eppie, discoursing cheerfully to her own small boot, which she was using as a bucket to convey the water into a deep hoof-mark, while her little naked foot was planted comfortably on a cushion of olive-green mud. A red-headed calf was observing her with alarmed doubt through the opposite hedge. Here was clearly a case of aberration in a christened child, which demanded severe treatment, but Silas, overcome with convulsive joy at finding his treasure again, could do nothing but snatch her up and cover her with half-sobbing kisses. It was not until he had carried her home, and had begun to think of the necessary washing, that he recollected the need that he should punish Eppie and make her remember. The idea that she might run away again and come to harm gave him unusual resolution, and for the first time he determined to try the coal-hole, a small closet near the hearth. "Naughty, naughty Eppie," he suddenly began, holding her on his knee and pointing to her muddy feet and clothes. "Naughty to cut with the scissors and run away. Eppie must go in the coal-hole for being naughty. Daddy must put her in the coal-hole." He half expected that this would be shock enough, and that Eppie would begin to cry, but instead of that she began to shake herself on his knee, as if the proposition opened a pleasing novelty. Seeing that he must proceed to extremities, he put her into the coal-hole and held the door closed, with a trembling sense that he was using a strong measure. For a moment there was silence, but then came a little cry, "Uppy, uppy," and Silas let her out again, saying, "Now, Eppie'll never be naughty again, else she must go in the coal-hole, a black naughty place." The weaving must stand still a long while this morning, for now Eppie must be washed and have clean clothes on, but it was to be hoped that this punishment would have a lasting effect, and save time in future, though perhaps it would have been better if Eppie had cried more. In half an hour she was clean again, and Silas, having turned his back to see what he could do with the linen band, threw it down again with the reflection that Eppie would be good without fastening for the rest of the morning. He turned round again, and was going to place her in a little chair near the loom, when she peeped out at him with black face and hands again, and said, Eppie in the toll-hole." This total failure of the coal-hole discipline shook Silas's belief in the efficacy of punishment. "She'd take it all for fun," he observed to Dolly, "if I didn't hurt her, and I can't do that, Mrs. Winthrop. If she makes me a bit of trouble I can bear it, and she's got no tricks but what she'll grow out of." "Well, that's partly true, Master Marner," said Dolly sympathetically. "And if you can't bring your mind to frighten her off touching things, you must do what you can to keep 'em out of her way. That's what I do with the pups as the lads are allays a-rearing. They will worry and gnaw they will, if it was one Sunday cap as hung anywhere so as they could drag it. They know no difference, God help 'em. It's the pushing of the teeth as sets 'em on, that's what it is." So Eppie was reared without punishment, the burden of her misdeeds being borne vicariously by Father Silas. The stone hut was made a soft nest for her, lined with downy patience, and also in the world that lay beyond the stone hut she knew nothing of frowns and denials. Notwithstanding the difficulty of carrying her and his yarn or linen at the same time, Silas took her with him on most of his journeys to the farmhouses, unwilling to leave her behind at Dolly Winthrop's, who was always ready to take care of her. And little curly-headed Eppie, the weaver's child, became an object of interest at several outlying homesteads as well as in the village. Hitherto he had been treated very much as if he had been a useful gnome or brownie, a queer and unaccountable creature, who must necessarily be looked at with wondering curiosity and repulsion, and with whom one would be glad to make all greetings and bargains as brief as possible, but who must be dealt with in a propitiatory way, and occasionally have a present of pork or garden stuff to carry home with him, seeing that without him there was no getting the yarn woven. But now Silas met with open smiling faces and cheerful questioning, as a person whose satisfactions and difficulties could be understood. Everywhere he must sit a little and talk about the child, and words of interest were always ready for him. "Ah, Master Marner, you'll be lucky if she takes the measles soon and easy." Or, "Why, there isn't many lone men 'ud ha' been wishing to take up with a little un like that. But I reckon the weaving makes you handier than men as do outdoor work. You're partly as handy as a woman, for weaving comes next to spinning." Elderly masters and mistresses, seated observantly in large kitchen armchairs, shook their heads over the difficulties attendant on rearing children, felt Eppie's round arms and legs, and pronounced them remarkably firm, and told Silas that if she turned out well, which, however, there was no telling, it would be a fine thing for him to have a steady lass to do for him when he got helpless. Servant maidens were fond of carrying her out to look at the hens and chickens, or to see if any cherries could be shaken down in the orchard, and the small boys and girls approached her slowly, with cautious movement and steady gaze, like little dogs face to face with one of their own kind, till attraction had reached the point at which the soft lips were put out for a kiss. No child was afraid of approaching Silas when Eppie was near him. There was no repulsion around him now, either for young or old, for the little child had come to link him once more with the whole world. There was love between him and the child that blent them into one, and there was love between the child and the world, from men and women with parental looks and tones to the red ladybirds and the round pebbles. Silas began now to think of Raveloe life entirely in relation to Eppie. She must have everything that was good in Raveloe, and he listened docilely that he might come to understand better what this life was, from which for 15 years he had stood aloof as from a strange thing, with which he could have no communion, as some man who has a precious plant to which he would give a nurturing home in a new soil thinks of the rain and the sunshine and all influences in relation to his nursling, and asks industriously for all knowledge that will help him to satisfy the wants of the searching roots, or to guard leaf and bud from invading harm. The disposition to hoard had been utterly crushed at the very first by the loss of his long-stored gold. The coins he earned afterwards seemed as irrelevant as stones brought to complete a house suddenly buried by an earthquake. The sense of bereavement was too heavy upon him for the old thrill of satisfaction to arise again at the touch of the newly earned coin. And now something had come to replace his hoard which gave a growing purpose to the earnings, drawing his hope and joy continually onward beyond the money. In old days there were angels who came and took men by the hand and led them away from the city of destruction. We see no white-winged angels now, But yet men are led away from threatening destruction. A hand is put into theirs, which leads them forth gently towards a calm and bright land, so that they look no more backward, and the hand may be a little child's. End of chapter 14. Chapter 15. There was one person, as you will believe, who watched with keener though more hidden interest than any other the prosperous growth of Eppie under the weaver's care. He dared not do anything that would imply a stronger interest in a poor man's adopted child than could be expected from the kindliness of the young squire, when a chance meeting suggested a little present to a simple old fellow whom others noticed with good will. But he told himself that the time would come when he might do something towards furthering the welfare of his daughter without incurring suspicion. Was he very uneasy in the meantime at his inability to give his daughter her birthright? I cannot say that he was. The child was being taken care of, and would very likely be happy, as people in humble stations often are, happier perhaps than those brought up in luxury. That famous ring that pricked its owner when he forgot duty and followed desire, I wonder if it pricked very hard when he set out on the chase, or whether it pricked but lightly then, and only pierced to the quick when the chase had long been ended, and hope, folding her wings, looked backward and became regret. Godfrey Cass's cheek and eye were brighter than ever now. He was so undivided in his aims that he seemed like a man of firmness. No Dunsey had come back. People had made up their minds that he was gone for a soldier, or gone out of the country, and no one cared to be specific in their inquiries on a subject delicate to a respectable family. Godfrey had ceased to see the shadow of Dunsey across his path, and the path now lay straight forward to the accomplishment of his best, longest cherished wishes. Everybody said Mr. Godfrey had taken the right turn, and it was pretty clear what would be the end of things, for there were not many days in the week that he was not seen riding to the Warrens. Godfrey himself, when he was asked jocosely if the day had been fixed, smiled with the pleasant consciousness of a lover who could say yes if he liked. He felt a reformed man, delivered from temptation, and the vision of his future life seemed to him as a promised land, for which he had no cause to fight. He saw himself with all his happiness centred on his own hearth, while Nancy would smile on him as he played with the children. And that other child, not on the hearth, he would not forget it. He would see that it was well provided for. That was a father's duty. End of chapter 15. Chapter 16. Part 2. It was a bright autumn Sunday, 16 years after Silas Marner had found his new treasure on the hearth. The bells of the old Raveloe church were ringing the cheerful peal which told that the morning service was ended, and out of the arched doorway in the tower came slowly, retarded by friendly greetings and questions, the richer parishioners who had chosen this bright Sunday morning as eligible for church-going. It was the rural fashion of the time for the more important members of the congregation to depart first, while their humbler neighbours waited and looked on, stroking their bent heads or dropping their curtsies to any large ratepayer who turned to notice them. Foremost among these advancing groups of well-clad people, there were some whom we shall recognise in spite of time, who has laid his hand on them all. The tall blond man of 40 is not much changed in feature from the Godfrey Cass of 6 and 20. He is only fuller in flesh, and has only lost the indefinable look of youth, a loss which is marked even when the eye is undulled and the wrinkles are not yet come. Perhaps the pretty woman, not much younger than he, who is leaning on his arm, is more changed than her husband. The lovely bloom that used to be always on her cheek now comes but fitfully, with a fresh morning air, or with some strong surprise. Yet to all who love human faces best for what they tell of human experience, Nancy's beauty has a heightened interest. Often the soul is ripened into fuller goodness while age has spread an ugly film, so that mere glances can never divine the preciousness of the fruit. But the years have not been so cruel to Nancy. The firm yet placid mouth, the clear voracious glance of the brown eyes, speak now of a nature that has been tested and has kept its highest qualities, and even the costume, with its dainty neatness and purity, has more significance now the coquetries of youth have nothing to do with it. Mr. and Mrs. Godfrey Cass, any higher title has died away from Raveloe lips, since the old squire was gathered to his fathers and his inheritance was divided, have turned round to look for the tall aged man and the plainly dressed woman who are a little behind, Nancy having observed that they must wait for father and Priscilla, and now they all turn into a narrower path leading across the churchyard into a small gate opposite the Red House. We will not follow them now, for may there not be some others in this departing congregation whom we should like to see again, some of those who are not likely to be handsomely clad, and whom we may not recognise so easily as the master and mistress of the Red House. But it is impossible to mistake Silas Marner. His large brown eyes seem to have gathered a longer vision, as is the way with eyes that have been short-sighted in early life, and they have a less vague, a more answering gaze. But in everything else one sees signs of a frame much enfeebled by the lapse of the 16 years. The weaver's bent shoulders and white hair give him almost the look of advanced age, though he is not more than 55, but there is the freshest blossom of youth close by his side, a blonde, dimpled girl of 18, who has vainly tried to chastise her curly auburn hair into smoothness under her brown bonnet. The hair ripples as obstinately as a brooklet under the March breeze, and the little ringlets burst away from the restraining comb behind and show themselves below the bonnet crown. Eppie cannot help being rather vexed about her hair, for there is no other girl in Raveloe who has hair at all like it, and she thinks hair ought to be smooth. She does not like to be blameworthy even in small things. You see how neatly her prayer-book is folded in her spotted handkerchief. That good-looking young fellow in a new fustian suit who walks behind her is not quite sure upon the question of hair in the abstract when Eppie puts it to him, and thinks that perhaps straight hair is the best in general, but he doesn't want Eppie's hair to be different. She surely divines that there is someone behind her who is thinking about her very particularly, and mustering courage to come to her side as soon as they are out in the lane, else why should she look rather shy, and take care not to turn her head away from her father Silas, to whom she keeps murmuring little sentences as to who was at church and who was not at church, and how pretty the red mountain ash is over the rectory wall. "I wish we had a little garden, father, with double daisies in like Mrs. Winthrop's," said Eppie when they were out in the lane. "Only they say it'd take a deal of digging and bringing fresh soil, and you couldn't do that, could you, father? Anyhow, I shouldn't like you to do it, for it'd be too hard work for you." "Yes, I could do it, child, if you want a bit of garden. These long evenings I could work at taking in a little bit of the waste, just enough for a root or two of flowers for you. And again in the morning I could have a turn with the spade before I sat down to the loom. Why didn't you tell me before as you wanted a bit of garden?" "I can dig it for you, Master Marner," said the young man in fustian, who was now by Eppie's side, entering into the conversation without the trouble of formalities. "It'll be play to me after I've done my day's work, or any odd bits of time when the work's slack. And I'll bring some soil from Mr. Cass's garden. He'll let me, and willin'." Aaron, my lad, are you there?" said Silas. "I wasn't aware of you, for when Eppie's talking of things I can see nothing but what she's a-saying. Well, if you could help me with the digging, we might get her a bit of garden all the sooner." "Then, if you think well and good," said Aaron, "I'll come to the stone pits this afternoon, and we'll settle what's to be taken in, and I'll get up an hour earlier the morning and begin on it." "But not if you don't promise me not to work at the hard digging, father," said Eppie, "for I shouldn't have said anything about it," she added, half bashfully, half roguishly, "only Mrs. Winthrop said as Aaron 'ud be so good, and—" "And you might ha' known it without mother telling you," said Aaron. "And Master Marner knows too, I hope, as I'm able and willing to do a turn of work for him, and he won't do me the unkindness to any ways take it out of my hands." "There now, father, you won't work on it till it's all easy," said Eppie, "and you and me can mark out the beds, and make holes and plant roots. It'll be a deal livelier at the stone pits when we've got some flowers, for I always think the flowers can see us and know what we're talking about. And I'll have a bit of rosemary and bergamot and thyme, because they're so sweet-smelling. But there's no lavender, only in the gentlefolks' gardens, I think." "That's no reason why you shouldn't have some," said Aaron, "for I can bring you slips of anything. I'm forced to cut no end of 'em when I'm gardening, and throw 'em away mostly. There's a big bed of lavender at the Red House. The missus is very fond of it." "Well," said Silas gravely, "so as you don't make free for us, or ask for anything as is worth much at the Red House. For Mr. Cass has been so good to us, and built up the new end of the cottage, and given us beds and things, as I couldn't abide to be imposing for garden stuff or anything else." "Well, no, no, there's no imposing," said Aaron. "Well, there's never a garden in all the parish but what there's endless waste in it for want of somebody as could use everything up. It's what I think to myself sometimes, as there need nobody run short of victuals if the land was made the most on, and there was never a morsel but what could find its way to a mouth. It sets one thinking of that, gardening does. But I must go back now, else mother'll be in trouble as I aren't there." "Bring her with you this afternoon, Aaron," said Eppie. "I shouldn't like to fix about the garden, and her not know everything from the first. Should you, father?" "Aye, bring her if you can, Aaron," said Silas. "She's sure to have a word to say as'll help us to set things on the right end." Aaron turned back up the village, while Silas and Eppie went on up the lonely sheltered lane. "Oh, Daddy," she began, when they were in privacy, clasping and squeezing Silas's arm, and skipping round to give him an energetic kiss. "My little old Daddy, I'm so glad. I don't think I shall want anything else when I've got a little garden. And I knew Aaron would dig it for us," she went on with roguish triumph. "I knew that very well." "You're a deep little puss, you are," said Silas, with the mild passive happiness of love-crowned age in his face. "But you'll make yourself fine and beholden to Aaron." "Oh no, I shan't," said Eppie, laughing and frisking. "He likes it." "Come, come, let me carry your prayer book, else you'll be dropping it jumping it that way." Eppie was now aware that her behaviour was under observation, but it was only the observation of a friendly donkey, browsing with a log fastened to his foot, a meek donkey, not scornfully critical of human trivialities, but thankful to share in them, if possible, by getting his nose scratched. And Eppie did not fail to gratify him with her usual notice, though it was attended with the inconvenience of his following them painfully up to the very door of their home. But the sound of a sharp bark inside, as Eppie put the key in the door, modified the donkey's views, and he limped away again without bidding. The sharp bark was the sign of an excited welcome that was awaiting them from a knowing brown terrier, who, after dancing at their legs in a hysterical manner, rushed with a worrying noise at a tortoise-shell kitten under the loom, and then rushed back with a sharp bark again, as much as to say, "I have done my duty by this feeble creature, you perceive," while the lady mother of the kitten sat sunning her white bosom in the window, and looked round with a sleepy air of expecting caresses, though she was not going to take any trouble for them. The presence of this happy animal life was not the only change which had come over the interior of the stone cottage. There was no bed now in the living-room, and the small space was well filled with decent furniture, all bright and clean enough to satisfy Dolly Winthrop's eye. The oaken table and three-cornered oaken chair were hardly what was likely to be seen in so poor a cottage. They had come, with the beds and other things, from the Red House. For Mr. Godfrey Cass, as every one said in the village, did very kindly by the weaver, and it was nothing but right that a man should be looked on and helped by those who could afford it when he had brought up an orphan child, and had been father and mother to her, and had lost his money too, so as he had nothing but what he worked for week by week, and when the weaving was going down too, for there was less and less flax spun, and Master Marner was none so young. Nobody was jealous of the weaver, for he was regarded as an exceptional person, whose claims on neighbourly help were not to be matched in Raveloe. Any superstition that remained concerning him had taken an entirely new colour, and Mr. Macey, now a very feeble old man of 66, never seen except in his chimney-corner or sitting in the sunshine at his door-sill, was of opinion that when a man had done what Silas had done by an orphan child, it was a sign that his money would come to light again, or leastwise that the robber would be made to answer for it, for, as Mr. Macey observed of himself, his faculties were as strong as ever. Silas sat down now and watched Eppie with a satisfied gaze as she spread the clean cloth and set on it the potato pie warmed up slowly in a safe Sunday fashion, by being put into a dry pot over a slow-dying fire, as the best substitute for an oven. For Silas would not consent to have a grate and oven added to his conveniences. He loved the old brick hearth as he had loved his brown pot, and was it not there when he had found Eppie? The gods of the hearth exist for us still, and let all new faith be tolerant of that fetishism, lest it bruise its own roots. Silas ate his dinner more silently than usual, soon laying down his knife and fork, and watching half abstractedly Eppie's play with Snap and the cat, by which her own dining was made rather a lengthy business. Yet it was a sight that might well arrest wandering thoughts. Eppie, with the rippling radiance of her hair and the whiteness of her rounded chin and throat set off by the dark blue cotton gown, laughing merrily as the kitten held on with her 4 claws to one shoulder, like a design for a jug handle, while Snap on the right hand and Puss on the other put up their paws towards a morsel which she held out of reach of both, Snap occasionally desisting in order to remonstrate with the cat by a cogent worrying growl on the greediness and futility of her conduct, till Eppie relented, caressing them both, and divided the morsel between them. But at last Eppie, glancing at the clock, checked the play and said, "Oh, Daddy, you're wanting to go into the sunshine to smoke your pipe. But I must clear away first, so as the house may be tidy when godmother comes. I'll make haste, I won't be long." Silas had taken to smoking a pipe daily during the last 2 years, having been urged to it by the sages of Raveloe as a practice good for the fits, and this advice was sanctioned by Dr. Kimble, on the ground that it was as well to try what could do no harm, a principle which was made to answer for a great deal of work in that gentleman's medical practice. Silas did not highly enjoy smoking, and often wondered how his neighbours could be so fond of it, but a humble sort of acquiescence in what was held to be good had become a strong habit of that new self which had been developed in him since he had found Eppie on his hearth. It had been the only clue his bewildered mind could hold by in cherishing this young life that had been sent to him out of the darkness into which his gold had departed. By seeking what was needful for Eppie, by sharing the effect that everything produced on her, he had himself come to appropriate the forms of custom and belief which were the mould of Raveloe life. And as, with reawakening sensibilities, memory also reawakened, he had begun to ponder over the elements of his old faith, and blend them with his new impressions, till he recovered a consciousness of unity between his past and present. The sense of presiding goodness and the human trust which come with all pure peace and joy had given him a dim impression that there had been some error, some mistake, which had thrown that dark shadow over the days of his best years. And as it grew more and more easy to him to open his mind to Dolly Winthrop, he gradually communicated to her all he could describe of his early life. The communication was necessarily a slow and difficult process, for Silas's meagre power of explanation was not aided by any readiness of interpretation in Dolly, whose narrow outward experience gave her no key to strange customs, and made every novelty a source of wonder that arrested them at every step of the narrative. It was only by fragments, and at intervals which left Dolly time to resolve what she had heard till it acquired some familiarity to her, that Silas at last arrived at the climax of the sad story, the drawing of lots, and its false testimony concerning him. And this had to be repeated in several interviews, under new questions on her part as to the nature of this plan for detecting the guilty and clearing the innocent. "Man, yourn's the same Bible, you're sure of that, Master Marner? The Bible as you brought with you from that country is the same as what we've got at the church, and what Eppie's a learning to read in?" "Yes," said Silas, "every bit the same. And there's drawing of lots in the Bible, mind you," he added in a lower tone. "Oh, dear, dear," said Dolly in a grieved voice, as if she were hearing an unfavourable report of a sick man's case. She was silent for some minutes. At last she said, "There's wise folks happen as know how it all is. The parson knows, I'll be bound. But it takes big words to tell them things, and such as poor folks can't make much out on. I can never rightly know the meaning of what I hear at church, only a bit here and there, but I knows it's good words, I do. But what lies upon your mind, it's this, Master Marner, as if them above have done the right thing by you, they'd never have let you be turned out for a wicked thief when you was innocent." "Ah," said Silas, who had now come to understand Dolly's phraseology, "that was what fell on me like as if it had been a red-hot iron, because, you see, there was nobody as cared for me or clave to me above nor below, and him as I'd gone out and in with for 10 year and more, since we was lads and went halves, my own familiar friend in whom I trusted, had lifted up his heel again me and worked to ruin me. But he was a bad un. I can't think as there's another such," said Dolly. "But a more come, Master Marner. I'm like as if I'd waked and didn't know whether it was night or morning. I feel somehow sure as I do when I've laid something up, though I can't justly put my hand on it, as there's a rights in what happened to you, if one could but make it out. And you'd no call to lose heart as you did. But we'll talk on it again, for sometimes things come into my head when I'm leeching or poulticing or such, as I could never think on when I was sitting still. Dolly was too useful a woman not to have many opportunities of illumination of the kind she alluded to, and she was not long before she recurred to the subject. "Master Marner," she said one day that she came to bring home Eppie's washing, "I've been sore puzzled for a good bit with that trouble o' yourn and the drawing o' lots, and it got twisted backwards and forwards as I didn't know which end to lay hold on. But it come to me all clear like that night when I was sitting up with poor Bessie Fawkes, as is dead and left her children behind, God help 'em. It came to me as clear as daylight. But whether I've got hold on it now, or can any ways bring it to my tongue's end, that I don't know. For I've often a deal inside me as'll never come out, and for what you talk o' your folks in your old country never saying prayers by heart nor saying 'em out of a book, they must be wonderful clever. For if I didn't know Our Father and little bits o' words as I can carry out at church with me, I might down on my knees every night, but nothing could I say." "But you can mostly say something as I can make sense on, Mrs. Winthrop," said Silas. "Well then, Master Marner, it came to me somewhat like this. I can make nothing of the drawing o' lots and the answer coming wrong. It'd mayhap take the parson to tell that, and he could only tell it us i' big words. But what came to me as clear as daylight, it was when I was troubling over poor Bessie Fawkes, and it always comes into my head when I'm sorry for folks, and feel as if I can't do a power to help 'em, not if I was to get up in the middle o' the night. It comes into my head as them above has got a deal tenderer heart nor what I've got. For I can't be anyways better nor them as made me, and if anything looks hard to me, it's because there's things I don't know on, and for the matter o' that, there may be plenty o' things I don't know on, for it's little as I know, that it is. And so, while I was thinking o' that, you came into my mind, Master Marner, and it all came pouring in. If I felt in my inside what was the right and just thing by you, and them as prayed and drawn the lots, all but the wicked un, if they'd ha' done the right thing by you if they could, isn't there them as was at the making on us, as knows better and has a better will? And that's all as ever I can be sure on, and everything else is a big puzzle to me when I think on it. For there was the fever came and took off them as were full growed, and left the helpless children, and there's the breaking o' limbs, and them as 'ud do right and be sober have to suffer by them as are contrary. There's trouble i' the world, and there's things as we can never make out the rights on. And all as we've got to do is to trust in, Master Marner. To do the right thing as far as we know, and to trust in. For if us as know so little can see a bit of good and rights, we may be sure there's a good and a rights bigger nor what we can know. I feel it in my inside as it must be so. And if you could but ha' gone on trusting, Master Marner, you wouldn't ha' run away from your fellow creatures and been so lone." "Ah, but that 'ud ha' been hard," said Silas in an undertone. "It 'ud ha' been hard to trust in then." "And so it would," said Dolly, almost with compunction. "Them things are easier said nor done, and I'm partly ashamed o' talking." "Nay, nay," said Silas, "you're in the right, Mrs. Winthrop, you're in the right. There's good i' this world, I've a feeling o' that now. And it makes a man feel as there's a good more nor he can see, i' spite o' the trouble and the wickedness. That drawing o' the lots is dark, but the child was sent to me. There's dealings with us, there's dealings." This dialogue took place in Eppie's earlier years, when Silas had to part with her for 2 hours every day, that she might learn to read at the dame school, after he had vainly tried himself to guide her in that first step to learning. Now that she was grown up, Silas had often been led, in those moments of quiet outpouring which come to people who live together in perfect love, to talk with her too of the past, and how and why he had lived a lonely man until she had been sent to him. For it would have been impossible for him to hide from Eppie that she was not his own child, even if the most delicate reticence on the point could have been expected from Raveloe gossips in her presence. Her own questions about her mother could not have been parried, as she grew up, without that complete shrouding of the past which would have made a painful barrier between their minds. So Eppie had long known how her mother had died on the snowy ground, and how she herself had been found on the hearth by Father Silas, who had taken her golden curls for his lost guineas brought back to him. The tender and peculiar love with which Silas had reared her in almost inseparable companionship with himself, aided by the seclusion of their dwelling, had preserved her from the lowering influences of the village talk and habits, and had kept her mind in that freshness which is sometimes falsely supposed to be an invariable attribute of rusticity. Perfect love has a breath of poetry which can exalt the relations of the least instructed human beings. And this breath of poetry had surrounded Eppie from the time when she had followed the bright gleam that beckoned her to Silas's hearth, so that it is not surprising if, in other things besides her delicate prettiness, she was not quite a common village maiden, but had a touch of refinement and fervour which came from no other teaching than that of tenderly nurtured, unvitiated feeling. She was too childish and simple for her imagination to rove into questions about her unknown father. For a long while it did not even occur to her that she must have a father, and the first time that the idea of her mother having had a husband presented itself to her was when Silas showed her the wedding ring which had been taken from the wasted finger, and had been carefully preserved by him in a little lacquered box shaped like a shoe. He delivered this box into Eppie's charge when she had grown up, and she often opened it to look at the ring, but still she thought hardly at all about the father of whom it was the symbol. Had she not a father very close to her, who loved her better than any real fathers in the village seemed to love their daughters? On the contrary, who her mother was, and how she came to die in that forlornness, were questions that often pressed on Eppie's mind. Her knowledge of Mrs. Winthrop, who was her nearest friend next to Silas, made her feel that a mother must be very precious, and she had again and again asked Silas to tell her how her mother looked, whom she was like, and how he had found her against the furze bush, led towards it by the little footsteps and the outstretched arms. The furze bush was there still, and this afternoon, when Eppie came out with Silas into the sunshine, it was the first object that arrested her eyes and thoughts. "Father," she said in a tone of gentle gravity, which sometimes came like a sadder, slower cadence across her playfulness, "we shall take the furze bush into the garden. It'll come into the corner, and just against it I'll put snowdrops and crocuses, 'cause Aaron says they won't die out, but'll always get more and more." "Ah, child," said Silas, always ready to talk when he had his pipe in his hand, apparently enjoying the pauses more than the puffs, "it wouldn't do to leave out the furze bush, and there's nothing prettier to my thinking when it's yellow with flowers. But it's just come into my head what we're to do for a fence. Mayhap Aaron can help us to a thought. But a fence we must have, else the donkeys and things will come and trample everything down. And fencing's hard to be got at by what I can make out." "Oh, I'll tell you, Daddy," said Eppie, clasping her hands suddenly after a minute's thought. "There's lots of loose stones about, some of 'em not big, and we might lay 'em atop one another and make a wall. You and me could carry the smallest, and Aaron 'ud carry the rest, I know he would." "Eh, my precious un," said Silas, "there isn't enough stones to go all round, and as for you carrying, why, with your little arms you couldn't carry a stone no bigger than a turnip. You're delicate made, my dear," he added, with a tender intonation. "That's what Mrs. Winthrop says." "Oh, I'm stronger than you think, Daddy," said Eppie, "and if there wasn't enough stones to go all round, why, they'll do part of the way, and then it'll be easier to get sticks and things for the rest. See here, round the big pit, what a many stones." She skipped forward to the pit, meaning to lift one of the stones and exhibit her strength, but she started back in surprise. "Oh, father, just come and look here," she exclaimed. "Come and see how the water's gone down since yesterday. Why, yesterday the pit was ever so full." "Well, to be sure," said Silas, coming to her side. "Why, that's the draining they've begun on since harvest, in Mr. Osgood's fields, I reckon. The foreman said to me the other day when I passed by him, 'Master Marner,' he said, 'I shouldn't wonder if we lay your bit of waste as dry as a bone.' It was Mr. Godfrey Cass, he said, had gone into the draining. He'd been taking the fields of Mr. Osgood." "How odd it'll be to have the old pit dried up," said Eppie, turning away, and stooping to lift rather a large stone. "See, Daddy, I can carry this quite well," she said, going along with much energy for a few steps, but presently letting it fall. "Ah, you're fine and strong, aren't you?" said Silas, while Eppie shook her aching arms and laughed. "Come, come, let us go and sit down on the bank against the stile here, and have no more lifting. You might hurt yourself, child. You'd need have somebody to work for you, and my arm isn't over strong." Silas uttered the last sentence slowly, as if it implied more than met the ear; and Eppie, when they sat down on the bank, nestled close to his side, and taking hold caressingly of the arm that was not over strong, held it on her lap while Silas puffed again dutifully at the pipe which occupied his other arm. The ash in the hedgerow behind made a fretted screen from the sun, and threw happy playful shadows all about them. "Father," said Eppie, very gently, after they had been sitting in silence a little while, "if I was to be married, ought I to be married with my mother's ring?" Silas gave an almost imperceptible start, though the question fell in with the undercurrent of thought in his own mind, and then said, in a subdued tone, "Why, Eppie, have you been a-thinking on it?" "Only this last week, father," said Eppie, ingenuously, "since Aaron talked to me about it." "And what did he say?" said Silas, still in the same subdued way, as if he were anxious lest he should fall into the slightest tone that was not for Eppie's good. "He said he should like to be married, because he was a-going in 24, and had got a deal of gardening work now Mr. Mott's given up. And he goes twice a week reg'lar to Mr. Cass's, and once to Mr. Osgood's, and they're going to take him on at the rectory." "And who is it he's wanting to marry?" said Silas, with rather a sad smile. "Why, me, to be sure, Daddy," said Eppie, with dimpling laughter, kissing her father's cheek, "as if he'd want to marry anybody else." "And you mean to have him, do you?" said Silas. "Yes, sometime," said Eppie. "I don't know when. Everybody's married sometime, Aaron says. But I told him that wasn't true, for I said, look at father, he's never been married." "No, child," said Silas. "Your father was a lone man till you was sent to him." "But you'll never be lone again, father," said Eppie, tenderly. "That was what Aaron said. I could never think o' taking you away from Master Marner, Eppie. And I said, it'd be no use if you did, Aaron. And he wants us all to live together, so as you won't need to work a bit, father, only what's for your own pleasure, and he'd be as good as a son to you. That's what he said." "And should you like that, Eppie?" said Silas, looking at her. "I shouldn't mind it, father," said Eppie, quite simply. "And I should like things to be so as you needn't work much. But if it wasn't for that, I'd sooner things didn't change. I'm very happy. I like Aaron to be fond of me, and to come and see us often, and behave pretty to you. He always does behave pretty to you, doesn't he, father?" "Yes, child, nobody could behave better," said Silas emphatically. "He's his mother's lad." "But I don't want any change," said Eppie. "I should like to go on a long, long while just as we are, only Aaron does want a change. And he made me cry a bit—only a bit, because he said I didn't care for him, for if I did care for him I should want us to be married as he did." "Eh, my blessed child," said Silas, laying down his pipe, as if it were useless to pretend to smoke any longer. "You're all young to be married. We'll ask Mrs. Winthrop. We'll ask Aaron's mother what she thinks. If there's a right thing to do, she'll come at it. But there's this to be thought on, Eppie. Things will change, whether we like it or no. Things won't go on for a long while just as they are, and no difference. I shall get older and helplesser, and be a burden on you, belike, if I don't go away from you altogether. Oh, not as I mean you'd think me a burden, I know you wouldn't, but it'd be hard upon you. And when I look forward to that, I like to think as you'd have somebody else besides me, somebody young and strong, as'll outlast your own life and take care on you to the end." Silas paused, and, resting his wrists on his knees, lifted his hands up and down meditatively as he looked on the ground. "Then you would like me to be married, father?" said Eppie, with a little trembling in her voice. "I'll not be the man to say no, Eppie," said Silas emphatically, "but we'll ask your godmother. She'll wish the right thing by you, and her son too." "There they come, then," said Eppie. "Let us go and meet them. Oh, the pipe! Won't you have it lit again, father?" said Eppie, lifting that medicinal appliance from the ground. "Nay, child," said Silas, "I've done enough for to-day. I think mayhap a little of it does me more good than so much at once." End of chapter 16. Chapter 17. While Silas and Eppie were seated on the bank discoursing in the fleckered shade of the ash-tree, Miss Priscilla Lammeter was resisting her sister's arguments, that it would be better to take tea at the Red House and let her father have a long nap than drive home to the Warrens so soon after dinner. The family party, of four only, were seated round the table in the dark wainscoted parlour, with a Sunday dessert before them of fresh filberts, apples, and pears, duly ornamented with leaves by Nancy's own hand before the bells had rung for church. A great change has come over the dark wainscoted parlour since we saw it in Godfrey's bachelor days, and under the wifeless reign of the old squire. Now all is polish on which no yesterday's dust is ever allowed to rest, from the yard's width of oaken boards round the carpet to the old squire's guns and whips and walking sticks ranged on the stag's antlers above the mantelpiece. All other signs of sporting and outdoor occupation Nancy has removed to another room, but she has brought into the Red House the habit of filial reverence, and preserves sacredly in a place of honour these relics of her husband's departed father. The tankards are on the side table still, but the bossed silver is undimmed by handling, and there are no dregs to send forth unpleasant suggestions. The only prevailing scent is of the lavender and rose leaves that fill the vases of Derbyshire spar. All is purity and order in this once dreary room, for 15 years ago it was entered by a new presiding spirit. "Now, father," said Nancy, "is there any call for you to go home to tea? Mayn't you just as well stay with us? Such a beautiful evening as it's likely to be." The old gentleman had been talking with Godfrey about the increasing poor rate and the ruinous times, and had not heard the dialogue between his daughters. "My dear, you must ask Priscilla," he said in the once firm voice, now become rather broken. "She manages me and the farm too." "And reason good as I should manage you, father," said Priscilla, "else you'd be giving yourself your death with rheumatism. And as for the farm, if anything turns out wrong, as it can't but do in these times, there's nothing kills a man so soon as having nobody to find fault with but himself. It's a deal the best way of being master, to let somebody else do the ordering, and keep the blaming in your own hands. It'd save many a man a stroke, I believe." "Well, well, my dear," said her father, with a quiet laugh, "I didn't say you don't manage for everybody's good." "Then manage so as you may stay to tea, Priscilla," said Nancy, putting her hand on her sister's arm affectionately. "Come now, and we'll go round the garden while father has his nap." "My dear child, he'll have a beautiful nap in the gig, for I shall drive. And as for staying to tea, I can't hear of it, for there's this dairymaid, now she knows she's to be married turned Michaelmas, she'll as lief pour the new milk into the pig trough as into the pans. That's the way with them all. It's as if they thought the world 'ud be new made because they're to be married. So come and let me put my bonnet on, and there'll be time for us to walk round the garden while the horse is being put in." When the sisters were treading the neatly swept garden walks, between the bright turf that contrasted pleasantly with the dark cones and arches and wall-like hedges of yew, Priscilla said, "I'm as glad as anything at your husband making that exchange of land with cousin Osgood, and beginning the dairying. It's 1,000 pities you didn't do it before, for it'll give you something to fill your mind. There's nothing like a dairy if folks want a bit of worrit to make the days pass. For as for rubbing furniture, when you can once see your face in a table, there's nothing else to look for. But there's always something fresh with a dairy, for even in the depths of winter there's some pleasure in conquering the butter, and making it come whether or no. My dear," added Priscilla, pressing her sister's hand affectionately as they walked side by side, "you'll never be low when you've got a dairy." "Ah, Priscilla," said Nancy, returning the pressure with a grateful glance of her clear eyes, "but it won't make up to Godfrey. A dairy's not so much to a man, and it's only what he cares for that ever makes me low. I'm contented with the blessings we have, if he can be contented." "It drives me past patience," said Priscilla impetuously, "that way of the men, always wanting and never easy with what they've got. They can't sit comfortable in their chairs when they've neither ache nor pain, but either they must stick a pipe in their mouths to make 'em better than well, or else they must be swallowing something strong, though they're forced to make haste before the next meal comes in. But joyful be it spoken, our father was never that sort of man. And if it had pleased God to make you ugly like me, so as the men wouldn't have run after you, we might have kept to our own family, and had nothing to do with folks as have got uneasy blood in their veins." "Oh, don't say so, Priscilla," said Nancy, repenting that she had called forth this outburst. "Nobody has any occasion to find fault with Godfrey. It's natural he should be disappointed at not having any children. Every man likes to have somebody to work for and lay by for, and he always counted on making a fuss of them when they were little. There's many another man 'ud hanker more than he does. He's the best of husbands." "Oh, I know," said Priscilla, smiling sarcastically. "I know the way of wives. They set one on to abuse their husbands, and then they turn round on one and praise 'em as if they wanted to sell 'em. But father'll be waiting for me. We must turn now." The large gig with the steady old grey was at the front door, and Mr. Lammeter was already on the stone steps, passing the time in recalling to Godfrey what very fine points Speckle had when his master used to ride him. "I always would have a good horse, you know," said the old gentleman, not liking that spirited time to be quite effaced from the memory of his juniors. "Mind you bring Nancy to the warrens before the week's out, Mr. Cass," was Priscilla's parting injunction, as she took the reins and shook them gently, by way of friendly incitement to Speckle. "I shall just take a turn to the fields against the stone pits, Nancy, and look at the draining," said Godfrey. "You'll be in again by tea-time, dear?" "Oh, yes, I shall be back in an hour." It was Godfrey's custom on a Sunday afternoon to do a little contemplative farming in a leisurely walk. Nancy seldom accompanied him, for the women of her generation, unless, like Priscilla, they took to outdoor management, were not given to much walking beyond their own house and garden, finding sufficient exercise in domestic duties. So, when Priscilla was not with her, she usually sat with Manse Bible before her, and after following the text with her eyes for a little while, she would gradually permit them to wander, as her thoughts had already insisted on wandering. But Nancy's Sunday thoughts were rarely quite out of keeping with the devout and reverential intention implied by the book spread open before her. She was not theologically instructed enough to discern very clearly the relation between the sacred documents of the past, which she opened without method, and her own obscure, simple life. But the spirit of rectitude and the sense of responsibility for the effect of her conduct on others, which were strong elements in Nancy's character, had made it a habit with her to scrutinize her past feelings and actions with self-questioning solicitude. Her mind not being courted by a great variety of subjects, she filled the vacant moments by living inwardly, again and again, through all her remembered experience, especially through the 15 years of her married time, in which her life and its significance had been doubled. She recalled the small details, the words, tones, and looks in the critical scenes which had opened a new epoch for her, by giving her a deeper insight into the relations and trials of life, or which had called on her for some little effort of forbearance, or of painful adherence to an imagined or real duty, asking herself continually whether she had been in any respect blameable. This excessive rumination and self-questioning is perhaps a morbid habit, inevitable to a mind of much moral sensibility when shut out from its due share of outward activity and of practical claims on its affections, inevitable to a noble-hearted, childless woman, when her lot is narrow. "I can do so little, have I done it all well?" is the perpetually recurring thought, and there are no voices calling her away from that soliloquy, no peremptory demands to divert energy from vain regret or superfluous scruple. There was one main thread of painful experience in Nancy's married life, and on it hung certain deeply felt scenes which were the oftenest revived in retrospect. The short dialogue with Priscilla in the garden had determined the current of retrospect in that frequent direction this particular Sunday afternoon. The first wandering of her thought from the text, which she still attempted dutifully to follow with her eyes and silent lips, was into an imaginary enlargement of the defence she had set up for her husband against Priscilla's implied blame. The vindication of the loved object is the best balm affection can find for its wounds. A man must have so much on his mind, is the belief by which a wife often supports a cheerful face, under rough answers and unfeeling words. And Nancy's deepest wounds had all come from the perception that the absence of children from their hearth was dwelt on in her husband's mind as a privation to which he could not reconcile himself. Yet sweet Nancy might have been expected to feel still more keenly the denial of a blessing to which she had looked forward with all the varied expectations and preparations, solemn and prettily trivial, which fill the mind of a loving woman when she expects to become a mother. Was there not a drawer filled with the neat work of her own hands, all unworn and untouched, just as she had arranged it there 14 years ago, just but for one little dress which had been made the burial dress? But under this immediate personal trial, Nancy was so firmly unmurmuring, that years ago she had suddenly renounced the habit of visiting this drawer, lest she should in this way be cherishing a longing for what was not given. Perhaps it was this very severity towards any indulgence of what she held to be sinful regret in herself that made her shrink from applying her own standards to her husband. It is very different. It is much worse for a man to be disappointed in that way. A woman can always be satisfied with devoting herself to her husband, but a man wants something that will make him look forward more, and sitting by the fire is so much duller to him than to a woman. And always, when Nancy reached this point in her meditations, trying with premeditated sympathy to see everything as Godfrey saw it, there came a renewal of self-questioning. Had she done everything in her power to lighten Godfrey's privation? Had she really been right in the resistance which had cost her so much pain 6 years ago, and again 4 years ago? The resistance to her husband's wish that they should adopt a child. Adoption was more remote from the ideas and habits of that time than of her own. Still, Nancy had her opinion on it. It was as necessary for her mind to have an opinion on all topics, not exclusively masculine, that had come under her notice, as for her to have a precisely marked place for every article of her personal property, and her opinions were always principles to be unwaveringly acted on. They were firm, not because of their basis, but because she held them with a tenacity inseparable from her mental action. On all the duties and proprieties of life, from filial behaviour to the arrangements of the evening toilet, pretty Nancy Lammeter, by the time she was 23, had her unalterable little code, and had formed every one of her habits in strict accordance with that code. She carried these decided judgments within her in the most unobtrusive way. They rooted themselves in her mind, and grew there as quietly as grass. Years ago, we know, she insisted on dressing like Priscilla, because it was right for sisters to dress alike, and because she would do what was right if she wore a gown dyed with cheese-colouring. That was a trivial but typical instance of the mode in which Nancy's life was regulated. It was one of those rigid principles, and no petty egoistic feeling, which had been the ground of Nancy's difficult resistance to her husband's wish. To adopt a child, because children of your own had been denied to you, was to try and choose your lot in spite of Providence. The adopted child, she was convinced, would never turn out well, and would be a curse to those who had wilfully and rebelliously sought what it was clear that, for some high reason, they were better without. When you saw a thing was not meant to be, said Nancy, it was a bounden duty to leave off so much as wishing for it. And so far, perhaps, the wisest of men could scarcely make more than a verbal improvement in her principle. But the conditions under which she held it apparent that a thing was not meant to be depended on a more peculiar mode of thinking. She would have given up making a purchase at a particular place if, on 3 successive times, rain or some other cause of heaven's sending had formed an obstacle, and she would have anticipated a broken limb or other heavy misfortune to anyone who persisted in spite of such indications. "But why should you think the child would turn out ill?" said Godfrey in his remonstrances. "She has thriven as well as child can do with the weaver, and he adopted her. There isn't such a pretty little girl anywhere else in the parish, or one fitter for the station we could give her. Where can be the likelihood of her being a curse to anybody?" "Yes, my dear Godfrey," said Nancy, who was sitting with her hands tightly clasped together, and with yearning, regretful affection in her eyes. "The child may not turn out ill to the weaver, but then he did not go to seek her, as we should be doing. It will be wrong, I feel sure it will. Don't you remember what that lady we met at the Royston Baths told us about the child her sister adopted? That was the only adopting I ever heard of, and the child was transported when it was 23. Dear Godfrey, don't ask me to do what I know is wrong. I should never be happy again. I know it is very hard for you. It's easier for me, but it's the will of Providence." It might seem singular that Nancy, with her religious theory pieced together out of narrow social traditions, fragments of church doctrine imperfectly understood, and girlish reasonings on her small experience, should have arrived by herself at a way of thinking so nearly akin to that of many devout people, whose beliefs are held in the shape of a system quite remote from her knowledge. Singular, if we did not know that human beliefs, like all other natural growths, elude the barriers of system. Godfrey had from the first specified Eppie, then about 12 years old, as a child suitable for them to adopt. It had never occurred to him that Silas would rather part with his life than with Eppie. Surely the weaver would wish the best to the child he had taken so much trouble with, and would be glad that such good fortune should happen to her. She would always be very grateful to him, and he would be well provided for to the end of his life, provided for as the excellent part he had done by the child deserved. Was it not an appropriate thing for people in a higher station to take a charge off the hands of a man in a lower? It seemed an eminently appropriate thing to Godfrey, for reasons that are known only to himself. And by a common fallacy he imagined the measure would be easy because he had private motives for desiring it. This was rather a coarse mode of estimating Silas's relation to Eppie, but we must remember that many of the impressions which Godfrey was likely to gather concerning the labouring people around him would favour the idea that deep affections can hardly go along with callous palms and scant means, and he had not had the opportunity, even if he had had the power, of entering immediately into all that was exceptional in the weaver's experience. It was only the want of adequate knowledge that could have made it possible for Godfrey deliberately to entertain an unfeeling project. His natural kindness had outlived the blighting time of cruel wishes, and Nancy's praise of him as a husband was not founded entirely on a wilful illusion. "I was right," she said to herself, when she had recalled all their scenes of discussion. "I feel I was right to say him nay, though it hurt me more than anything. But how good Godfrey has been about it! Many men would have been very angry with me for standing out against their wishes, and they might have thrown out that it had ill luck in marrying me. But Godfrey has never been the man to say an unkind word. It's only what he can't hide. Everything seems so blank to him, I know, and the land, what a difference it'd make to him, when he goes to see after things, if he'd children growing up that he was doing it all for. But I won't murmur, and perhaps if he'd married a woman who'd have had children, she'd have vexed him in some other ways." This possibility was Nancy's chief comfort, and to give it greater strength she laboured to make it impossible that any other wife should have had more perfect tenderness. She had been forced to vex him by that one denial. Godfrey was not insensible to her loving effort, and did Nancy no injustice as to the motives of her obstinacy. It was impossible to have lived with her 15 years and not be aware that an unselfish clinging to the right, and a sincerity clear as the flower-born dew, were her main characteristics. Indeed, Godfrey felt this so strongly that his own more wavering nature, too averse to facing difficulty to be unvaryingly simple and truthful, was kept in a certain awe of this gentle wife who watched his looks with a yearning to obey them. It seemed to him impossible that he should ever confess to her the truth about Eppie. She would never recover from the repulsion the story of his earlier marriage would create, told to her now after that long concealment. And the child, too, he thought, must become an object of repulsion. The very sight of her would be painful. The shock to Nancy's mingled pride and ignorance of the world's evil might even be too much for her delicate frame. Since he had married her with that secret in his heart, he must keep it there to the last. Whatever else he did, he could not make an irreparable breach between himself and his long-loved wife. Meanwhile, why could he not make up his mind to the absence of children from a hearth brightened by such a wife? Why did his mind fly uneasily to that void, as if it were the sole reason why life was not thoroughly joyous to him? I suppose it is the way with all men and women who reach middle age without the clear perception that life never can be thoroughly joyous. Under the vague dullness of the grey hours, dissatisfaction seeks a definite object, and finds it in the privation of an untried good. Dissatisfaction, seated musingly on a childless hearth, thinks with envy of the father whose return is greeted by young voices, seated at the meal where their little heads rise one above the other, like nursery plants. It sees a black care hovering behind every one of them, and thinks the impulses by which men abandon freedom and seek for ties are surely nothing but brief madness. In Godfrey's case there were further reasons why his thoughts should be continually solicited by this one point in his lot. His conscience, never thoroughly easy about Eppie, now gave his childless home the aspect of a retribution, and as the time passed on under Nancy's refusal to adopt her, any retrieval of his error became more and more difficult. On this Sunday afternoon it was already 4 years since there had been any allusion to the subject between them, and Nancy supposed it was for ever buried. I wonder if he'll mind it less or more as he gets older, she thought. I'm afraid more. Aged people feel the miss of children. What would father do without Priscilla? And if I die, Godfrey will be very lonely, not holding together with his brothers much. But I won't be over-anxious and trying to make things out beforehand. I must do my best for the present. With that last thought Nancy roused herself from her reverie, and turned her eyes again towards the forsaken page. It had been forsaken longer than she imagined, for she was presently surprised by the appearance of the servant with the tea-things. It was, in fact, a little before the usual tea-time, but Jane had her reasons. "Is your master come into the yard, Jane?" "No, ma'am, he isn't," said Jane, with a slight emphasis, of which, however, her mistress took no notice. "I don't know whether you've seen him, ma'am," continued Jane, after a pause, "but there's folks making haste all one way, afore the front window. I doubt something's happened. There's never a man to be seen in the yard, else I should send and see. I've been up to the top attic, but there's no seeing anything for trees. I hope nobody's hurt, that's all." "Oh no, I daresay there's nothing much the matter," said Nancy. "It's perhaps Mr. Snell's bull got out again, as he did before." "I wish he mayn't gore anybody then, that's all," said Jane, not altogether despising a hypothesis which covered a few imaginary calamities. "That girl's always terrifying me," thought Nancy. "I wish Godfrey would come in." She went to the front window, and looked as far as she could see along the road, with an uneasiness which she felt to be childish, for there were now no such signs of excitement as Jane had spoken of, and Godfrey would not be likely to return by the village road, but by the fields. She continued to stand, however, looking at the placid churchyard, with the long shadows of the gravestones across the bright green hillocks, and at the glowing autumn colours of the rectory trees beyond. Before such calm external beauty, the presence of a vague fear is more distinctly felt, like a raven flapping its slow wing across the sunny air. Nancy wished more and more that Godfrey would come in. End of chapter 17. Chapter 18. Someone opened the door at the other end of the room, and Nancy felt that it was her husband. She turned from the window with gladness in her eyes, for the wife's chief dread was stilled. "Dear, I'm so thankful you're come," she said, going towards him. "I began to get—" She paused abruptly, for Godfrey was laying down his hat with trembling hands, and turned towards her with a pale face and a strange unanswering glance, as if he saw her indeed, but saw her as part of a scene invisible to herself. She laid her hand on his arm, not daring to speak again, but he left the touch unnoticed, and threw himself into his chair. Jane was already at the door with a hissing urn. "Tell her to keep away, will you?" said Godfrey, and when the door was closed again he exerted himself to speak more distinctly. "Sit down, Nancy. There," he said, pointing to a chair opposite him. "I came back as soon as I could, to hinder anybody's telling you but me. I've had a great shock, but I care most about the shock it'll be to you." "It isn't father and Priscilla," said Nancy with quivering lips, clasping her hands together tightly on her lap. "No, it's nobody living," said Godfrey, unequal to the considerate skill with which he would have wished to make his revelation. "It's Dunstan, my brother Dunstan, that we lost sight of 16 years ago. We found him, found his body, his skeleton." The deep dread Godfrey's look had created in Nancy made her feel these words a relief. She sat in comparative calmness to hear what else he had to tell. He went on. "The stone pit has gone dry suddenly from the draining, I suppose, and there he lies, has lain for 16 years, wedged between two great stones. There's his watch and seals, and there's my gold-handled hunting whip, with my name on. He took it away without my knowing the day he went hunting on Wildfire, the last time he was seen." Godfrey paused. It was not so easy to say what came next. "Do you think he drowned himself?" said Nancy, almost wondering that her husband should be so deeply shaken by what had happened all those years ago to an unloved brother, of whom worse things had been augured. "No, he fell in," said Godfrey in a low but distinct voice, as if he felt some deep meaning in the fact. Presently he added, "Dunstan was the man that robbed Silas Marner." The blood rushed to Nancy's face and neck at this surprise and shame, for she had been bred up to regard even a distant kinship with crime as a dishonour. "Oh, Godfrey," she said, with compassion in her tone, for she had immediately reflected that the dishonour must be felt still more keenly by her husband. "There was the money in the pit," he continued, "all the weaver's money. Everything's been gathered up, and they're taking the skeleton to the Rainbow. But I came back to tell you. There was no hindering it, you must know." He was silent, looking on the ground for 2 long minutes. Nancy would have said some words of comfort under this disgrace, but she refrained, from an instinctive sense that there was something behind, that Godfrey had something else to tell her. Presently he lifted his eyes to her face and kept them fixed on her as he said, "Everything comes to light, Nancy, sooner or later. When God Almighty wills it, our secrets are found out. I've lived with this secret on my mind, but I'll keep it from you no longer. I wouldn't have you know it by somebody else, and not by me. I wouldn't have you find it out after I'm dead. I'll tell you now. It's been my will and I won't with me all my life. I'll make sure of myself now." Nancy's utmost dread had returned. The eyes of the husband and wife met with awe in them, as at a crisis which suspended affection. "Nancy," said Godfrey slowly, "when I married you I hid something from you, something I ought to have told you. That woman Marner found dead in the snow, Eppie's mother, that wretched woman, was my wife. Eppie's my child." He paused, dreading the effect of his confession, but Nancy sat quite still, only that her eyes dropped and ceased to meet his. She was pale and quiet as a meditative statue, clasping her hands on her lap. "You'll never think the same of me again," said Godfrey after a little while, with some tremor in his voice. She was silent. "I oughtn't to have left the child unowned. I oughtn't to have kept it from you. But I couldn't bear to give you up, Nancy. I was led away into marrying her, and I suffered for it." Still Nancy was silent, looking down, and he almost expected that she would presently get up and say she would go to her father's. How could she have any mercy for faults that must seem so black to her, with her simple, severe notions? But at last she lifted up her eyes to his again and spoke. There was no indignation in her voice, only deep regret. "Godfrey, if you had but told me this 6 years ago, we could have done some of our duty by the child. Do you think I'd have refused to take her in if I'd known she was yours?" At that moment Godfrey felt all the bitterness of a never that was not simply futile, but had defeated its own end. He had not measured this wife with whom he had lived so long. She spoke again with more agitation. "And, oh, Godfrey, if we'd had her from the first, if you'd taken to her as you ought, she'd have loved me for her mother, and you'd have been happier with me. I could have better borne my little baby dying, and our life might have been more like we used to think it'd be." The tears fell, and Nancy ceased to speak. "But you wouldn't have married me then, Nancy, if I'd told you," said Godfrey, urged in the bitterness of a self-reproach to prove to himself that his conduct had not been utter folly. "You may think you would now, but you wouldn't then. With your pride and your father's, you'd have hated having anything to do with me after the talk there'd have been." "I can't say what I should have done about that, Godfrey. I should never have married anybody else. But I wasn't worth doing wrong for. Nothing is in this world. Nothing is so good as it seems beforehand. Not even our marrying wasn't, you see." There was a faint, sad smile on Nancy's face as she said the last words. "I'm a worse man than you'd thought I was, Nancy," said Godfrey, rather tremulously. "Can you forgive me, ever?" "The wrong to me is but little, Godfrey. You've made it up to me. You've been good to me for 15 years. It's another you did the wrong to, and I doubt it can ever all be made up for." "But we can take Eppie now," said Godfrey. "I wouldn't mind the world knowing at last. I'll be plain and open for the rest of my life." "It'll be different coming to us now she's grown up," said Nancy, shaking her head sadly. "But it's your duty to acknowledge her and provide for her, and I'll do my part by her, and pray to God Almighty to make her love me. Then we'll go together to Silas Marner's this very night, as soon as everything's quiet at the stone pits." End of Chapter 18. Chapter 19. Between 8 and 9 o'clock that evening, Eppie and Silas were seated alone in the cottage. After the great excitement the weaver had undergone from the events of the afternoon, he had felt a longing for this quietude, and had even begged Mrs. Winthrop and Aaron, who naturally lingered behind every one else, to leave him alone with his child. The excitement had not passed away. It had only reached that stage when the keenness of the susceptibility makes external stimulus intolerable, when there is no sense of weariness, but rather an intensity of inward life, under which sleep is an impossibility. Anyone who has watched such moments in other men remembers the brightness of the eyes and the strange definiteness that comes over coarse features from that transient influence. It is as if a new fineness of ear for all spiritual voices has sent wonder-working vibrations through the heavy mortal frame, as if beauty born of murmuring sound had passed into the face of the listener. Silas's face showed that sort of transfiguration as he sat in his arm-chair and looked at Eppie. She had drawn her own chair towards his knees and leaned forward, holding both his hands while she looked up at him. On the table near them, lit by a candle, lay the recovered gold, the long-loved gold ranged in orderly heaps, as Silas used to range it in the days when it was his only joy. He had been telling her how he used to count it every night, and how his soul was utterly desolate till she was sent to him. "At first, I'd a sort of feeling come across me now and then," he was saying in a subdued tone, "as if you might be changed into the gold again, for sometimes, turn my head which way I would, I seemed to see the gold. And I thought I should be glad if I could feel it and find it was come back, but that didn't last long. After a bit I should have thought it was a curse come again if it had drove you from me, for I'd got to feel the need o' your looks and your voice and the touch of your little fingers. You didn't know then, Eppie, when you were such a little un, you didn't know what your old father Silas felt for you." "But I know now, father," said Eppie. "If it hadn't been for you they'd have taken me to the workhouse, and there'd have been nobody to love me." "Eh, my precious child, the blessing was mine. If you hadn't been sent to save me, I should have gone to the grave in my misery. The money was taken away from me in time, and you see it's been kept till it was wanted for you. It's wonderful. Our life is wonderful." Silas sat in silence a few minutes, looking at the money. "It takes no hold of me now," he said ponderingly, "the money doesn't. I wonder if it ever could again. I doubt it might if I lost you, Eppie. I might come to think I was forsaken again, and lose the feeling that God was good to me." At that moment there was a knocking at the door, and Eppie was obliged to rise without answering Silas. Beautiful she looked, with the tenderness of gathering tears in her eyes, and a slight flush on her cheeks as she stepped to open the door. The flush deepened when she saw Mr. and Mrs. Godfrey Cass. She made her little rustic curtsy, and held the door wide for them to enter. "We're disturbing you very late, my dear," said Mrs. Cass, taking Eppie's hand, and looking in her face with an expression of anxious interest and admiration. Nancy herself was pale and tremulous. Eppie, after placing chairs for Mr. and Mrs. Cass, went to stand against Silas, opposite to them. "Well, Marner," said Godfrey, trying to speak with perfect firmness, "it's a great comfort to me to see you with your money again that you've been deprived of so many years. It was one of my family did you the wrong, the more grief to me, and I feel bound to make up to you for it in every way. Whatever I can do for you will be nothing but repaying a debt, even if I look no further than the robbery. But there are other things I'm shall be beholden to you for, Marner." Godfrey checked himself. It had been agreed between him and his wife that the subject of his fatherhood should be approached very carefully, and that, if possible, the disclosure should be reserved for the future, so that it might be made to Eppie gradually. Nancy had urged this because she felt strongly the painful light in which Eppie must inevitably see the relation between her father and mother. Silas, always ill at ease when he was being spoken to by betters, such as Mr. Cass, tall, powerful, florid men, seen chiefly on horseback, answered with some constraint. "Sir, I've a deal to thank you for already. As for the robbery, I count it no loss to me. And if I did, you couldn't help it. You aren't answerable for it. You may look at it in that way, Marner, but I never can, and I hope you'll let me act according to my own feeling of what's just. I know you're easily contented. You've been a hard-working man all your life." "Yes, sir, yes," said Marner meditatively. "I should have been bad off without my work. It was what I held by when everything else was gone from me." "Ah," said Godfrey, applying Marner's words simply to his bodily wants. "It was a good trade to you in this country, because there's been a great deal of linen weaving to be done. But you're getting rather past such close work, Marner. It's time you laid by and had some rest. You look a good deal pulled down, though you're not an old man, are you?" "55, as near as I can say, sir," said Silas. "Oh, why, you may live 30 years longer. Look at old Macey. And that money on the table, after all, is but little. It won't go far either way, whether it's put out to interest, or you were to live on it as long as it would last. It wouldn't go far if you'd nobody to keep but yourself, and you've had two to keep for a good many years now." "Nay, sir," said Silas, unaffected by anything Godfrey was saying, "I'm in no fear of want. We shall do very well. Eppie and me'll do well enough. There's few working folks have got so much laid by as that. I don't know what it is to gentlefolks, but I look upon it as a deal, almost too much. And as for us, it's little we want." "Only the garden, father," said Eppie, blushing up to the ears the moment after. "You love a garden, do you, my dear?" said Nancy, thinking that this turn in the point of view might help her husband. "We should agree in that. I give a deal of time to the garden." "Ah, there's plenty of gardening at the Red House," said Godfrey, surprised at the difficulty he found in approaching a proposition which had seemed so easy to him in the distance. "You've done a good part by Eppie Marner for 16 years. It'd be a great comfort to you to see her well provided for, wouldn't it? She looks blooming and healthy, but not fit for any hardships. She doesn't look like a strapping girl come of working parents. You'd like to see her taken care of by those who can leave her well off, and make a lady of her. She's more fit for it than for a rough life, such as she might come to have in a few years' time." A slight flush came over Marner's face, and disappeared like a passing gleam. Eppie was simply wondering Mr. Cass should talk so about things that seemed to have nothing to do with reality, but Silas was hurt and uneasy. "I don't take your meaning, sir," he answered, not having words at command to express the mingled feelings with which he had heard Mr. Cass's words. "Well, my meaning is this, Marner," said Godfrey, determined to come to the point. "Mrs. Cass and I, you know, have no children, nobody to benefit by our good home and everything else we have, more than enough for ourselves. And we should like to have somebody in the place of a daughter to us. We should like to have Eppie, and treat her in every way as our own child, and it'd be a great comfort to you in your old age, I hope, to see her fortune made in that way, after you've been at the trouble of bringing her up so well. And it's right you should have every reward for that. And Eppie, I'm sure, will always love you and be grateful to you. She'd come and see you very often, and we should be all on the lookout to do everything we could towards making you comfortable." A plain man like Godfrey Cass, speaking under some embarrassment, necessarily blunders on words that are coarser than his intentions, and that are likely to fall gratingly on susceptible feelings. While he had been speaking, Eppie had quietly passed her arm behind Silas's head, and let her hand rest against it caressingly. She felt him trembling violently. He was silent for some moments when Mr. Cass had ended, powerless under the conflict of emotions all alike painful. Eppie's heart was swelling at the sense that her father was in distress, and she was just going to lean down and speak to him, when one struggling dread at last gained the mastery over every other in Silas, and he said faintly, "Eppie, my child, speak. I won't stand in your way. Thank Mr. and Mrs. Cass." Eppie took her hand from her father's head and came forward a step. Her cheeks were flushed, but not with shyness this time. The sense that her father was in doubt and suffering banished that sort of self-consciousness. She dropped a low curtsy, first to Mrs. Cass and then to Mr. Cass, and said, "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir. But I can't leave my father, nor own anybody nearer than him, and I don't want to be a lady, thank you, all the same." Here Eppie dropped another curtsy. "I couldn't give up the folks I've been used to." Eppie's lips began to tremble a little at the last words. She retreated to her father's chair again, and held him round the neck, while Silas, with a subdued sob, put up his hand to grasp hers. The tears were in Nancy's eyes, But her sympathy with Eppie was, naturally, divided with distress on her husband's account. She dared not speak, wondering what was going on in her husband's mind. Godfrey felt an irritation inevitable to almost all of us when we encounter an unexpected obstacle. He had been full of his own penitence and resolution to retrieve his error as far as the time was left to him. He was possessed with all-important feelings that were to lead to a predetermined course of action which he had fixed on as the right, and he was not prepared to enter with lively appreciation into other people's feelings counteracting his virtuous resolves. The agitation with which he spoke again was not quite unmixed with anger. "But I've a claim on you, Eppie, the strongest of all claims. It's my duty, Marner, to own Eppie as my child, and provide for her. She is my own child. Her mother was my wife. I've a natural claim on her that must stand before every other." Eppie had given a violent start and turned quite pale. Silas, on the contrary, who had been relieved by Eppie's answer, from the dread lest his mind should be in opposition to hers, felt the spirit of resistance in him set free, not without a touch of parental fierceness. "Then, sir," he answered, with an accent of bitterness that had been silent in him since the memorable day when his youthful hope had perished, "then, sir, why didn't you say so 16 years ago, and claim her before I'd come to love her, instead of coming to take her from me now, when you might as well take the heart out of my body? God gave her to me because you turned your back upon her, and he looks upon her as mine. You've no right to her. When a man turns a blessing from his door, it falls to them as take it in. I know that, Marner. I was wrong, and I've repented of my conduct in that matter," said Godfrey, who could not help feeling the edge of Silas's words. "I'm glad to hear it, sir," said Marner, with gathering excitement. "But repentance won't alter what's been going on for 16 years. And your coming now and saying I'm her father doesn't alter the feelings inside us. It's me she's been calling her father ever since she could say the word." "But I think you might look at the thing more reasonably, Marner," said Godfrey, unexpectedly awed by the weaver's direct truth-speaking. "It isn't as if she was to be taken quite away from you, so that you'd never see her again. She'll be very near you, and come to see you very often. She'll feel just the same towards you." "Just the same?" said Marner, more bitterly than ever. "How'll she feel just the same for me as she does now, when we eat of the same bit and drink of the same cup, and think of the same things from one day's end to the other? Just the same? That's idle talk. You'd cut us at two." Godfrey, unqualified by experience to discern the pregnancy of Marner's simple words, felt rather angry again. It seemed to him that the weaver was very selfish, a judgment readily passed by those who have never tested their own power of sacrifice, to oppose what was undoubtedly for Eppie's welfare, and he felt himself called upon, for her sake, to assert his authority. "I should have thought, Marner," he said severely, "I should have thought your affection for Eppie would make you rejoice in what was for her good, even if it did call upon you to give up something. You ought to remember your own life's uncertain, and she's at an age now when her lot may soon be fixed in a very different way from what it would be in her father's home. She may marry some low-working man, and then, whatever I might do for her, I couldn't make her well off. You're putting yourself in the way of her welfare, and though I'm sorry to hurt you after what you've done, and what I've left undone, I feel now it's my duty to insist on taking care of my own daughter. I want to do my duty." It would be difficult to say whether it was Silas or Eppie that was more deeply stirred by this last speech of Godfrey's. Thought had been very busy in Eppie as she listened to the contest between her old long-loved father and this new unfamiliar father who had suddenly come to fill the place of that black featureless shadow which had held the ring and placed it on her mother's finger. Her imagination had darted backward in conjectures and forward in previsions of what this revealed fatherhood implied, and there were words in Godfrey's last speech which helped to make the previsions especially definite. Not that these thoughts, either of past or future, determined her resolution. That was determined by the feelings which vibrated into every word Silas had uttered. But they raised, even apart from these feelings, a repulsion towards the offered lot and the newly revealed father. Silas, on the other hand, was again stricken in conscience, and alarmed lest Godfrey's accusation should be true, lest he should be raising his own will as an obstacle to Eppie's good. For many moments he was mute, struggling for the self-conquest necessary to the uttering of the difficult words. They came out tremulously. I'll say no more. Let it be as you will. Speak to the child. I'll hinder nothing." Even Nancy, with all the acute sensibility of her own affections, shared her husband's view that Marner was not justifiable in his wish to retain Eppie, after her real father had avowed himself. She felt that it was a very hard trial for the poor weaver, but her code allowed no question that a father by blood must have a claim above that of any foster father. Besides, Nancy, used all her life to plenteous circumstances and the privileges of respectability, could not enter into the pleasures which early nurture and habit connect with all the little aims and efforts of the poor who are born poor. To her mind, Eppie, in being restored to her birthright, was entering on a too long withheld but unquestionable good. Hence she heard Silas's last words with relief, and thought, as Godfrey did, that their wish was achieved. "Eppie, my dear," said Godfrey, looking at his daughter, not without some embarrassment, under the sense that she was old enough to judge him, "it'll always be our wish that you should show your love and gratitude to one who's been a father to you so many years, and we shall want to help you to make him comfortable in every way. But we hope you'll come to love us as well, and though I haven't been what a father should have been to you all these years, I wish to do the utmost in my power for you for the rest of my life, and provide for you as my only child. And you'll have the best of mothers in my wife. That'll be a blessing you haven't known since you were old enough to know it." "My dear, you'll be a treasure to me," said Nancy in her gentle voice. "We shall want for nothing when we have our daughter." Eppie did not come forward and curtsy as she had done before. She held Silas's hand in hers, and grasped it firmly. It was a weaver's hand, with a palm and finger-tips that were sensitive to such pressure, while she spoke with colder decision than before. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, sir, for your offers. They're very great, and far above my wish. For I should have no delight in life any more if I was forced to go away from my father, and knew he was sitting at home a-thinking of me and feeling known. We've been used to be happy together every day, and I can't think of no happiness without him. And he says he'd nobody of the world till I was sent to him, and he'd have nothing when I was gone, and he's took care of me and loved me from the first, and I'll cleave to him as long as he lives, and nobody shall ever come between him and me." "But you must make sure, Eppie," said Silas in a low voice, "you must make sure as you won't ever be sorry, because you've made your choice to stay among poor folks, and with poor clothes and things, when you might ha' had everything of the best." His sensitiveness on this point had increased as he listened to Eppie's words of faithful affection. "I can never be sorry, father," said Eppie. "I shouldn't know what to think on or to wish for, with fine things about me, as I haven't been used to. And it 'ud be poor work for me to put on things, and ride in a gig, and sit in a place at church, as 'ud make them as I'm fond of think me unfitting company for them. What could I care for then?" Nancy looked at Godfrey with a pained, questioning glance, but his eyes were fixed on the floor, where he was moving the end of his stick, as if he were pondering on something absently. She thought there was a word which might perhaps come better from her lips than from his. "What you say is natural, my dear child. It's natural you should cling to those who've brought you up," she said mildly. "But there's a duty you owe to your lawful father. There's perhaps something to be given up on more sides than one. When your father opens his home to you, I think it is right you shouldn't turn your back on it." "I can't feel as if I've got any father but one," said Eppie impetuously, while the tears gathered. "I've always thought of a little home where he'd sit at the corner, and I should fend and do everything for him. I can't think of no other home. I wasn't brought up to be a lady, and I can't turn my mind to it. I like the working folks, and their victuals and their ways. And," she ended passionately while the tears fell, "I'm promised to marry a working man, as'll live with father, and help me to take care of him." Godfrey looked up at Nancy with a flushed face and smarting, dilated eyes. This frustration of a purpose towards which he had set out under the exalted consciousness that he was about to compensate, in some degree, for the greatest demerit of his life, made him feel the air of the room stifling. "Let us go," he said in an undertone. "We won't talk of this any longer now," said Nancy, rising. "We're your well-wishers, my dear, and yours too, Marner. We shall come and see you again. It's getting late now." In this way she covered her husband's abrupt departure, for Godfrey had gone straight to the door, unable to say more. End of chapter 19. Chapter 20. Nancy and Godfrey walked home under the starlight in silence. When they entered the oaken parlour, Godfrey threw himself into his chair, while Nancy laid down her bonnet and shawl, and stood on the hearth near her husband, unwilling to leave him even for a few minutes, and yet fearing to utter any word lest it might jar on his feeling. At last Godfrey turned his head towards her, and their eyes met, dwelling in that meeting without any movement on either side. That quiet mutual gaze of a trusting husband and wife is like the first moment of rest or refuge from a great weariness or a great danger, not to be interfered with by speech or action which would distract the sensations from the fresh enjoyment of repose. But presently he put out his hand, and as Nancy placed hers within it, he drew her towards him and said, "That's ended." She bent to kiss him, and then said, as she stood by his side, "Yes, I'm afraid we must give up the hope of having her for a daughter. It wouldn't be right to want to force her to come to us against her will. We can't alter her bringing up and what's come of it." "No," said Godfrey, with a keen decisiveness of tone, in contrast with his usually careless and unemphatic speech. "There's debts we can't pay like money debts, by paying extra for the years that have slipped by. While I've been putting off and putting off, the trees have been growing. It's too late now. Marner was in the right in what he said about a man's turning away a blessing from his door. It falls to somebody else. I wanted to pass for childless once, Nancy. I shall pass for childless now, against my wish." Nancy did not speak immediately, but after a little while she asked, "You won't make it known, then, about Eppie's being your daughter?" "No. Where would be the good to anybody? Only harm. I must do what I can for her in the state of life she chooses. I must see who it is she is thinking of marrying." "If it won't do any good to make the thing known," said Nancy, who thought she might now allow herself the relief of entertaining a feeling which she had tried to silence before, "I should be very thankful for father and Priscilla never to be troubled with knowing what was done in the past, more than about Dunsey. It can't be helped their knowing that." "I shall put it in my will. I think I shall put it in my will. I shouldn't like to leave anything to be found out like this of Dunsey," said Godfrey meditatively. "But I can't see anything but difficulties that'd come from telling it now. I must do what I can to make her happy in her own way. I've a notion," he added after a moment's pause, "it's Aaron Winthrop she meant she was engaged to. I remember seeing him with her and Marner going away from church." "Well, he's very sober and industrious," said Nancy, trying to view the matter as cheerfully as possible. Godfrey fell into thoughtfulness again. Presently he looked up at Nancy sorrowfully and said, "She's a very pretty, nice girl, isn't she, Nancy?" "Yes, dear, and with just your hair and eyes. I wondered it had never struck me before." "I think she took a dislike to me at the thought of my being her father. I could see a change in her manner after that." "She couldn't bear to think of not looking on Marner as her father," said Nancy, not wishing to confirm her husband's painful impression. "She thinks I did wrong by her mother as well as by her. She thinks me worse than I am. But she must think it. She can never know all. It's part of my punishment, Nancy, for my daughter to dislike me. I should never have got into that trouble if I'd been true to you, if I hadn't been a fool. I'd no right to expect anything but evil could come of that marriage. And when I shirked doing a father's part too." Nancy was silent. Her spirit of rectitude would not let her try to soften the edge of what she felt to be a just compunction. He spoke again after a little while, but the tone was rather changed. There was tenderness mixed with the previous self-reproach. "And I got you, Nancy, in spite of all. And yet I've been grumbling and uneasy because I hadn't something else, as if I deserved it." "You've never been wanting to me, Godfrey," said Nancy, with quiet sincerity. "My only trouble would be gone if you resigned yourself to the lot that's been given us." "Well, perhaps it isn't too late to mend a bit there, though it is too late to mend some things, say what they will." End of chapter 20. Chapter 21. The next morning, while Silas and Eppie were seated at their breakfast, he said to her, "Eppie, there's a thing I have in my mind to do this 2 year, and now the money's been brought back to us, we can do it. I've been turning it over and over in the night, and I think we'll set out to-morrow, while the fine days last. We leave the house and everything for your godmother to take care on, and we'll make a little bundle of things and set out." "Where to go, daddy?" said Eppie, in much surprise. "To my old country, to the town where I was born, up Lantern Yard. I want to see Mr. Paston, the minister. Something may have come out to make him know I was innocent of the robbery, and Mr. Paston was a man with a deal of light. I want to speak to him about the drawing of the lots, and I should like to talk to him about the religion of this countryside, for I partly think he doesn't know on it." Eppie was very joyful, for there was the prospect not only of wonder and delight at seeing a strange country, but also of coming back to tell Aaron all about it. Aaron was so much wiser than she was about most things, it would be rather pleasant to have this little advantage over him. Mrs. Winthrop, though possessed with the dim fear of dangers attendant on so long a journey, and requiring many assurances that it would not take them out of the region of carriers' carts and slow waggons, was nevertheless well pleased that Silas should revisit his own country, and find out if he had been cleared from that false accusation. "You'd be easier in your mind for the rest of your life, Master Marner," said Dolly, "that you would. And if there's any light to be got up the yard as you talk on, we've need of it in this world, and I'd be glad of it myself if you could bring it back." So on the 4th day from that time, Silas and Eppie, in their Sunday clothes, with a small bundle tied in a blue linen handkerchief, were making their way through the streets of a great manufacturing town. Silas, bewildered by the changes 30 years had brought over his native place, had stopped several persons in succession to ask them the name of this town, that he might be sure he was not under a mistake about it. "Ask for Lantern Yard, father. Ask this gentleman with the tassels on his shoulder, standing at the shop door. He isn't in a hurry like the rest," said Eppie, in some distress at her father's bewilderment, and ill at ease besides amidst the noise, the movement, and the multitude of strange, indifferent faces. "Hey, my child, he won't know anything about it," said Silas. "Gentlefolks didn't ever go up the yard. But happen somebody can tell me which is the way to Prison Street, where the jail is. I know the way out of that as if I'd seen it yesterday." With some difficulty, after many turnings and new inquiries, they reached Prison Street, and the grim walls of the jail, the first object that answered to any image in Silas's memory, cheered him with certitude, which no assurance of the town's name had hitherto given him, that he was in his native place. "Ah," he said, drawing a long breath, "there's the jail, Eppie. That's just the same. I aren't afraid now. It's the 3rd turning on the left hand from the jail doors. That's the way we must go." "Oh, what a dark, ugly place," said Eppie. "How it hides the sky! It's worse than the workhouse. I'm glad you don't live in this town now, father. Is Lantern Yard like this street?" "My precious child," said Silas, smiling, "it isn't a big street like this. I never was easy of this street myself, but I was fond of Lantern Yard. The shops here are all altered, I think. I can't make 'em out, but I shall know the turning, because it's the 3rd. Here it is," he said in a tone of satisfaction, as they came to a narrow alley. "And then we must go down to the left again, and then straight forward for a bit, up Shoe Lane, and then we shall be at the entry next to the overhanging window, where there's a nick in the road for the water to run. I can see it all." "Oh, father, I'm like as if I was stifled," said Eppie. "I shouldn't have thought as any folks lived i' this way, so close together. How pretty the stone pits'll look when we get back." "It looks comical to me, child, now, and smells bad. I can't think as it usen't to smell so." Here and there a sallow, begrimed face looked out from a gloomy doorway at the strangers, and increased Eppie's uneasiness, so that it was a long for relief when they issued from the alleys into Shoe Lane, where there was a broader strip of sky. "Dear heart," said Silas, "why, there's people coming out of the yard, as if they'd been to chapel at this time o' day, a weekday noon." Suddenly he started and stood still with a look of distressed amazement that alarmed Eppie. They were before an opening in the front of a large factory, from which men and women were streaming for their midday meal. "Father," said Eppie, clasping his arm, "what's the matter?" But she had to speak again and again before Silas could answer her. "It's gone, child," he said at last, in strong agitation. "Lantern Yard's gone. It must have been here, because there's the house with the o'erhanging window. I know that, it's just the same. But they've made this new opening, and see that big factory. It's all gone, chapel and all." "Come into that little brush shop and sit down, father. They'll let you sit down," said Eppie, always on the watch lest one of her father's strange attacks should come on. "Perhaps the people can tell you all about it." But neither from the brushmaker who had come to Shoe Lane only 10 years ago, when the factory was already built, nor from any other source within his reach, could Silas learn anything of the old Lantern Yard friends, or of Mr. Paston the minister. "The old place is all swept away," Silas said to Dolly Winthrop on the night of his return. "The little graveyard and everything. The old home's gone. I've no home but this now. I shall never know whether they got at the truth about the robbery, or whether Mr. Paston could have given me any light about the drawing of the lots. It's dark to me, Mrs. Winthrop, that is. I doubt it'll be dark to the last." "Well, yes, Master Marner," said Dolly, who sat with a placid listening face, now bordered by grey hairs. "I doubt it may. It's the will of them above as many things should be dark to us, but there's some things as I've never felt i' the dark about, and they're mostly what comes o' the day's work. You were hard done by that once, Master Marner, and it seems as you'll never know the rights of it. But that doesn't hinder there being a rights, Master Marner, for it's all dark to you and me." "No," said Silas, "no, that doesn't hinder. Since the time the child was sent to me, and I've come to love her as myself, I've had light enough to trust him by. And now she says she'll never leave me, I think I shall trust him till I die." End of chapter 21. Conclusion. There was one time of the year which was held in Raveloe to be especially suitable for a wedding. It was when the great lilacs and laburnums in the old-fashioned gardens showed their golden and purple wealth above the lichen-tinted walls, and when there were calves still young enough to want bucketfuls of fragrant milk. People were not so busy then as they must become when the full cheese-making and the mowing had set in, and besides, it was a time when a light bridal dress could be worn with comfort and seen to advantage. Happily the sunshine fell more warmly than usual on the lilac tufts the morning that Eppie was married, for her dress was a very light one. She had often thought, though with a feeling of renunciation, that the perfection of a wedding dress would be a white cotton, with the tiniest pink sprig at wide intervals, so that when Mrs. Godfrey Cass begged to provide one, and asked Eppie to choose what it should be, previous meditation had enabled her to give a decided answer at once. Seen at a little distance as she walked across the churchyard and down the village, she seemed to be attired in pure white, and her hair looked like a dash of gold on a lily. One hand was on her husband's arm, and with the other she clasped the hand of her father, Silas. "You won't be giving me away, father," she had said before they went to church. "You'll only be taking Aaron to be a son to you." Dolly Winthrop walked behind with her husband, and there ended the little bridal procession. There were many eyes to look at it, and Miss Priscilla Lammeter was glad that she and her father had happened to drive up to the door of the Red House just in time to see this pretty sight. They had come to keep Nancy company to-day, because Mr. Cass had had to go away to Litherley for special reasons. That seemed to be a pity, for otherwise he might have gone, as Mr. Crackenthorpe and Mr. Osgood certainly would, to look on at the wedding feast which he had ordered at the Rainbow, naturally feeling a great interest in the weaver who had been wronged by one of his own family. "I could have wished Nancy had had the luck to find a child like that and bring her up," said Priscilla to her father as they sat in the gig. "I should have had something young to think of then, besides the lambs and the calves." "Yes, my dear, yes," said Mr. Lammeter. "One feels that as one gets older. Things look dim to old folks. They'd need have some young eyes about 'em to let 'em know the world's the same as it used to be." Nancy came out now to welcome her father and sister, and the wedding group had passed on beyond the Red House to the humbler part of the village. Dolly Winthrop was the first to divine that old Mr. Macey, who had been set in his armchair outside his own door, would expect some special notice as they passed, since he was too old to be at the wedding feast. "Mr. Macey's looking for a word from us," said Dolly. "He'll be hurt if we pass him and say nothing, and him so racked with rheumatiz." So they turned aside to shake hands with the old man. He had looked forward to the occasion, and had his premeditated speech. "Well, Master Marner, he said in a voice that quavered a good deal. "I've lived to see my words come true. But I was the first to say there was no harm in you, though your looks might be again you. And I was the first to say you'd get your money back. And it's nothing but rightful as you should. And I'd ha' said the amens and willing at the holy matrimony. But Tucky's done it a good while now, and I hope you'll have none the worse luck." In the open yard before the Rainbow, the party of guests were already assembled, although it was still nearly an hour before the appointed feast time. But by this means they could not only enjoy the slow advent of their pleasure, they also had ample leisure to talk of Silas Marner's strange history, and arrived by due degrees at the conclusion that he had brought a blessing on himself by acting like a father to a lone motherless child. Even the farrier did not negative this sentiment. On the contrary, he took it up as peculiarly his own, and invited any hardy person present to contradict him. But he met with no contradiction, and all differences among the company were merged in a general agreement with Mr. Snell's sentiment that when a man had deserved his good luck, it was the part of his neighbours to wish him joy. As the bridal group approached, a hearty cheer was raised in the Rainbow yard, and Ben Winthrop, whose jokes had retained their acceptable flavour, found it agreeable to turn in there and receive congratulations, not requiring the proposed interval of quiet at the Stone Pits before joining the company. Eppie had a larger garden than she had ever expected there now, and in other ways there had been alterations at the expense of Mr. Cass, the landlord, to suit Silas's larger family, for he and Eppie had declared that they would rather stay at the Stone Pits than go to any new home. The garden was fenced in with stones on two sides, but in front there was an open fence, through which the flowers shone with answering gladness, as the four united people came within sight of them. "Oh, father," said Eppie, "what a pretty home ours is! I think nobody could be happier than we are." That is the end of Silas Marner by George Eliot. Read by Tadhg.